In 1986, life for the Andrews family was turned completely upside down. The two teenage sisters, Annie and Jessica, suddenly and tragically lost their mother to cancer. Her death was fairly abrupt, and it caught everyone by surprise, leaving a huge hole in the family. After she was gone, Annie and Jessica lived full-time with their father, Brian. Now, Brian had always been a hard worker, but with the loss of his wife, he had to take on even more hours just to make ends meet and provide for his two daughters. The general has intensive. He was a single father now, and the weight of that was immense. For Annie and Jessica, the loss was devastating. They had been incredibly close with their mom, and now, with their dad gone at work so often, the house felt quiet and empty. The two sisters were left alone a lot, just them and their thoughts, and all they could think about was how much they missed their mother. The grief was a constant, heavy presence in the house. So one night, while Brian was out on a late shift, the girls came up with an idea. They decided they would try to use a Ouija board to contact their mom. They would later admit they didn't really expect anything to happen, but they were just so desperate for some kind of connection, any sign that she was still with them. They went down into the basement and found the old board game. They set it up, but they didn't really do any research on how a seance was supposed to work. They just sat down, put their hands on the planchette, and started asking simple questions. They asked if their mother was there. They asked if she could give them a sign. For a couple of hours, they sat there in the quiet basement, focusing all their energy on their mom. And of course, nothing really happened. The planchette didn't move on its own. There were no strange noises or flickering lights. Eventually, they decided to put the board away. But in a way, the whole experience was cathartic for them. It gave them a chance to just sit and think about their mom, to talk to her, and to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she could hear them. Even if it was just in their heads, it made them feel closer to her for a little while. So, feeling a bit better, they put the Ouija board away and went back upstairs. They had a quiet rest of the evening and eventually decided to just head to bed. Their father still wasn't home, but this was normal. They were used to it. Annie and Jessica went to their separate bedrooms, and as they were lying there in the dark trying to fall asleep, they both started to hear something. It was a faint tapping sound. At first, they probably thought they were imagining it. But the sound was persistent. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls. Jessica got up and quietly went into Annie's room. She whispered, asking if Annie heard the tapping too. And Annie said yes, she did. They sat there together, listening intently. The house would fall silent, and then it would start again. A soft, rhythmic tapping from somewhere deep within the structure of the house. They had never heard anything like it before. Now, these two girls were grieving deeply. Their minds immediately went back to the seance they had just performed. Could it be? Was this the sign they had asked for? They wanted to believe it so badly. They started whispering to each other that it must be their mom. She was trying to get in touch with them. The seance must have actually worked. And so, what started as a potentially scary sound turned into something hopeful. They started asking questions out loud into the empty room. They asked, "Mom, are you here with us right now?" They asked if she could show herself, if she was okay, if she was watching over them. It was a strange mix of fear and comfort. The idea of a spirit in their house was unsettling, but the thought that it was their mother's spirit there to look after them was deeply reassuring. When their father, Brian, finally got home from work that night, the tapping had stopped. The girls rushed to tell him what happened. They were excited, not scared. They told him about the Ouija board and then about the tapping sounds in the walls, convinced it was their mom. Brian was exhausted. He'd worked a long day, and he was still processing his own grief over losing his wife. He listened to his daughters, and his heart broke for them. He was sure they were just making it up, a product of their grief and their desire to have their mother back. He thought, they're struggling, they miss their mom so much, and this is how it's coming out. That first night, he even considered getting them into some kind of therapy or grief counseling. not because he was angry, but because he was worried. He saw this as a clear sign that they weren't coping well. But for now, he just tried to calm them down. He told them, "Look, girls, just go back to bed. I'm sure she's looking out for all of us." He didn't want to dismiss their feelings entirely, but he also didn't want to encourage what he saw as a fantasy. So the girls went back to their rooms, and Brian didn't think too much more of it that night. He was just a tired, grieving father worried about his kids. But the tapping didn't stop. Over the next several days, it continued, and it actually started to get more frequent. It got so persistent that it began to disturb the girls' sleep. Night after night, they would lie awake, listening to the tapping inside the walls. And every time they would get scared and call for their father to come check on it, the moment he would step into the room, the tapping would stop. It was maddening for them. It made them feel like they were going crazy. Then, other strange things started to happen. When the family would leave the house for the day, for school or work, they would come back to find things out of place. It was always small things, subtle changes. A piece of furniture would be moved just slightly from its original position. Some of the silverware in the kitchen drawer would be rearranged. Little objects on shelves would be shifted around. It was just enough to be noticeable, to create a feeling that someone or something had been there while they were gone. Of course, Annie and Jessica were convinced it was the spirit of their mother. But Brian was having none of it. He sat them down and told them firmly that this had to stop. He said, "Guys, I know this is you. I know how much you miss your mom, and I know you want this to be real. You want her to be here with us, but she's not. You have to stop moving the furniture around. This whole ghost thing is not healthy." He warned them that if it continued, he was going to insist they start seeing a grief counselor. For the girls, this was a terrible blow. They were adamant that it wasn't them. They were genuinely scared now. And the fact that their own father didn't believe them made them feel completely alone. The initial comfort they had felt, the belief that it was their mother, was starting to fade. This didn't feel like something their mom would do. Moving things around, playing games, trying to scare them, it felt more sinister. They started to think that maybe when they used that Ouija board, they had let something else in. Something evil. And now it was in their house, terrorizing them, and there was nothing they could do because the one person who was supposed to protect them thought they were making it all up. One evening in January of 1987, a few weeks into this strange ordeal, the girls were together in the front room of the house, and they started to hear the tapping sounds again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls around them. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. After weeks of being scared and feeling helpless, something inside them snapped. They felt a sudden surge of confidence, or maybe just desperation. They decided they were going to go down there and confront whatever this thing was. Their father wasn't home to help, and he wouldn't believe them anyway. They had to face this on their own. So they took a deep breath and headed for the basement stairs. As they went down, the tapping stopped. The basement was quiet and still. They looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. They couldn't find any source for the noise. Feeling a little bit foolish, like they were on a ghost hunt that had led nowhere, they turned to go back upstairs. But as they did, they saw it. Scrawled on the basement wall in what looked like red paint or marker were the words, "Come find me. I'm in your closet." They froze. This was different. This was terrifying. It was no longer just tapping or moved furniture. This was a direct message. It was confirmation that something was actively messing with them, taunting them. It wasn't their mother. This felt like a threat. The girls didn't hesitate. They screamed and ran out of the basement, out of the house, and straight next door to their neighbors. They pounded on the door, hysterical, and told their neighbors that something weird was happening in their house. They tried to explain about the writing on the wall, but they were probably not making much sense. The neighbors, seeing how genuinely terrified they were, let them in and told them to just wait there until their father got home. A little while later, they saw Brian's car pull into the driveway. They ran out and flagged him down, and he came over to the neighbor's house. The neighbor pulled Brian aside and explained what had happened, that the girls had come over in a complete panic. Annie and Jessica then told their dad that there was writing on the wall in the basement. Brian's first reaction was frustration. This was just too much. He thought now they're defacing the property to keep this fantasy going. For him, this was the line. It had gone from a coping mechanism to something totally unhealthy. Still, he went over to the house with them to see for himself. He went down into the basement, and there it was, just as they had described. Red writing on the wall. But instead of being scared, he was just angry at his daughters. He immediately ordered them to start grief counseling. This was no longer a suggestion, it was a demand. And so they began seeing a therapist. And for a while, it seemed to work. For several weeks after that incident, the house was completely silent. There was no tapping. Nothing was ever out of place. It was almost like whatever had been haunting them had just given up and left. Then, one night, Brian was working late again and the girls were home alone. They were sitting together in the front room, enjoying the peace and quiet they had finally gotten back. And then, they heard it. The tapping. It was back. They got up and slowly, cautiously made their way through the house, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It led them to Annie's bedroom. When they opened the door and looked inside, their hearts sank. Written on her bedroom wall were new words. I'm back. Find me if you can. It was happening all over again. They did the only thing they could think to do. They ran. They fled the house and went straight back to the same neighbor's house. They explained that it had happened again, begging the neighbor to believe them. The neighbor let them stay, and they all waited for Brian to come home. When he arrived, the same scene played out. He was flagged down and brought over to the neighbors. This time, when he heard the story, Brian was furious. He confronted the girls, saying, I put you in counseling. I told you to stop doing this. This is not okay. He was at his wit's end. He then told the girls and the neighbor to stay right where they were. He was going to go into that house himself and search it from top to bottom. He was going to prove to them, once and for all, that there was nothing to be afraid of. So he marched back over to his own house, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. And he stopped dead in his tracks. The house was in total disarray. It looked like it had been completely ransacked. Furniture was overturned, drawers were pulled out, things were thrown everywhere. And his first thought was, the girls didn't do this. Someone else had been in his house. Suddenly, he was on edge. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold fear. He walked cautiously through the trashed rooms, listening for any sound, but it was silent. He made his way upstairs to Annie's bedroom. He saw the writing on the wall, just as they had described. And then he looked towards the closet, and he saw a man standing there. The man was wearing women's clothes. In fact, they were his dead wife's clothes. He was also wearing a wig and carrying a small hatchet. This figure, this man in a dress, was just standing in the closet, staring at Brian. Brian was completely startled. For a second, he was just frozen. Then, the man in the dress started running. He charged out of the closet, and Brian, reacting on instinct, tried to grab him to fight him, but the man was fast and managed to push past Brian and run out of the room. Brian, shaken but now filled with adrenaline, started chasing after him. But the guy was quick. By the time Brian got downstairs, the man was gone. He searched the house frantically, but there was no sign of him. Realizing the man had a hatchet, Brian decided the safest thing to do was get out. He ran out of the house back to his neighbors and yelled for them to call 911. There was an intruder. He stayed with his daughters while the police arrived. They went into the house and conducted a thorough search. They looked everywhere, but they couldn't find anyone. They told Brian that they were sure someone had been there based on his very convincing story and the state of the house, but the person was long gone now. There wasn't much they could do other than advise him not to stay there that night. They said they would keep an eye on the house, do some patrols, but until the intruder was caught, it wasn't safe for the family to be there. And so, the family was left with no answers. Who was that person? How did he get in? And more importantly, how did he get away? Brian was racking his brain. A man in a dress carrying a hatchet is a pretty distinctive sight. How could he just vanish into the neighborhood without anyone seeing him? For the next 2 weeks, Brian and his daughters stayed with relatives. It was a horrible, traumatizing time. Brian was consumed with guilt. He felt like a terrible father. He had left his girls alone night after night in a house with some crazy person living inside of it. He had never believed them. He kept thinking about what could have happened and how it would have been all his fault. The girls were equally traumatized. They now knew that for weeks they had been interacting with a real, dangerous person who was hiding in their home, a person with an axe. But after 2 weeks, living with relatives in a cramped space was getting difficult. And at this point, they reasoned that whoever that man was, he must be long gone. The police were watching the house. They decided it was time to go home. They would get a new security system, be more careful, but they had to get back to their lives. So, they packed up their things and headed back. As Brian was driving up his own street, he looked at his house, and he noticed something odd. There was a light on in one of the second-floor windows. He thought that was strange. He knew the police were patrolling the neighborhood, but he didn't think they were actually inside his house. As he was looking up at that window, about to pull into his driveway, he saw him. The man in the dress. He walked right past the window, clear as day. Brian slammed on the brakes. He immediately grabbed his daughters, made sure they were safe, and called the police again. This time, he knew the man was still inside. Police were there in seconds. They surrounded the house completely. There was no way anyone was getting out this time. With the house completely surrounded, the police finally made their entry. No one had been inside that house since Brian and the girls had left 2 weeks prior. They had locked it up tight. When the officers opened the front door, they were met with a bizarre and disturbing scene. Not only was all the furniture flipped upside down and moved all over the place again, but there were pennies glued to the ceiling, hundreds of them just stuck up there. And there was red writing everywhere on all the walls in strange, cryptic messages. The police searched the entire house again, top to bottom. But just like before, they didn't find anyone. They were about to conclude that the person had somehow slipped away again, but one of the officers who was searching the basement noticed something. He saw a small piece of wood that looked like it was covering a crawl space behind the washer and dryer. He found that he could move the appliances aside fairly easily. Behind them was a board. When he pulled the board away, it revealed the entrance to a dark, narrow crawl space. Inside this crawl space, the police made a shocking discovery. Someone had burrowed tunnels through the insulation, creating a hidden network that ran throughout the entire house inside the walls. There were small peepholes drilled into the walls in almost every room, allowing whoever was in there to look out and see everything that was going on. And as they followed this intricate maze of tunnels, they found him. Hiding deep within the walls of the house was Danny LaPlante. It turns out Danny was a teenager who had briefly dated Annie. After they had broken up, he had secretly snuck into their house and had been living in their walls for months. He had been listening to every conversation. He heard them talking about their mother's passing. He watched them through the peepholes as they performed the seance with the Ouija board. And he used all of that information to orchestrate the entire haunting. He was the one tapping on the walls. he was the one writing messages with ketchup. He would sneak out at night when they were asleep or when the house was empty to move the furniture around, and then he would slip back into his hiding spot. After Danny LaPlante was pulled out of the crawl space, he was arrested and placed in a juvenile detention center. But the story doesn't end there. Later, in 1987, after he was released, for reasons that nobody really understands, Danny broke into another family's home. And this time, he murdered almost the entire family in cold blood. The idea of someone living in your walls for months is horrifying enough. But to know that it was a psychopath like Danny LaPlante takes it to another level. That final scene, when the police go in and find the pennies glued to the ceiling and the writing everywhere before finding him in that hidden crawl space, it's like something straight out of a horror movie. It's so bizarre, it almost doesn't seem real. But it was. And you just have to think about the trauma that the Andrews family went through. Not just the loss of their mother, but then this terrifying ordeal and the horrifying realization of what could have happened to them. They were living with a future murderer and they never even knew it. It's a kind of deep-seated trauma that you can only hope they were somehow able to recover from. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. It was a beautiful summer day in 1906, the kind of day when everything felt peaceful, almost perfect. Dr. William C. Clark and his wife Harriet were driving through the quiet roads of northwest Connecticut, not just in search of a beautiful view, they are looking for an escape. The Clark family lives full-time in New York City. And compared to what they are used to, this place feels like a completely different world. At home, Doctor. Clark is a successful oncologist, a cancer expert, and a professor at Columbia Medical School. Their lives are busy, noisy, and always in motion. What they want now is something different. A quiet place, an untouched place. Somewhere they can escape the noise of the city. So, when they arrive in Litchfield County, it feels exactly like that. At least at first. Because not every place that looks peaceful is truly so. But what they are about to find hidden in those mountains will lead them to a place they could never have imagined. And so, as this couple from New York drove along these quiet back roads, their car eventually came to this beautiful old covered bridge made of wood. They drove across it, and as they came out the other side, a new view opened up to them. Off to their right, a huge mountainside rose up, and high on that mountain was a vast, shaded, beautiful forest. They could just make out a small road that seemed to branch off from the main one and disappear right into those woods. The couple had absolutely no idea what was up there, but it was just so stunningly beautiful. They felt an immediate pull towards it, the sense that they just had to see what was inside that forest. They decided right then and there to go check it out to see if maybe, just maybe, this was the spot for their second home. So, Doctor. Clark turned the car and started heading up this little access road. Very quickly, as they began to climb the hillside, the road got really bumpy and overgrown with weeds and grass. It was pretty obvious that not many people, and certainly not many cars, ever drove up this way. Before they had even reached the tree line, the road became so rough that Dr. Clark had to pull the car over to the side and park it. He and Harriet got out. From there, they decided they would just continue on foot, walking the rest of the way up towards the forest. The moment the couple actually stepped into the forest, it was like entering another world. The bright sunlight immediately faded away. The canopy of leaves and branches above their heads was so thick that it blocked out most of the light. The air became cool and wonderfully refreshing. After they had been walking for only a couple of minutes, the forest, which at first had seemed so still and quiet, suddenly came alive with sound. They could hear birds chirping from every direction. They heard the rustling of small animals running through the underbrush. They could hear insects buzzing all around them. And then, up ahead, they saw a field just off the side of the road. It was filled with these wild apple trees, their branches growing in every which direction. As the Clarks got a little closer, they saw a deer standing right in the middle of all those apple trees. It was calmly eating apples right off the branches, completely undisturbed by their presence. Just past this field of apple trees, the couple began to pass these huge, beautiful patches of wild roses and lilacs. There were also these bright yellow flowers called bitter tansy that lined both sides of the road. Before long, their path had them stepping over these little babbling brooks, the water so clear you could see the stones at the bottom. Off in the distance, they could hear the sound of more running water, like a fresh spring coming down from higher up on the mountain. As they walked deeper, the sun did begin to poke through the thick canopy in little patches. And when it did, it looked almost like the forest itself was sparkling. It was a strange and beautiful effect. It turns out this entire forest was sitting on a hillside, and the rock that made up the hill was full of a mineral called mica. And when sunlight hits mica, it shimmers and sparkles almost like it's covered in glitter. And of course, there were the owls. As Dr. Clark and his wife walked farther and farther into this incredible forest, they heard more and more owls hooting off in the distance. To the Clarks, this sound didn't feel spooky at all. It made the forest feel enchanted, almost magical. It was as if the owls were personally welcoming them to this special place. By the time the couple had turned around and started heading back down the path towards their car, their minds were already made up. They were going to build their second home right here in this forest. So, after they returned to their home in New York, they immediately put in the paperwork to purchase 1,000 acres of land inside that Connecticut forest. The forest, they learned, had a name. It was called Dark Entry. It got its name because, from the outside, the forest always looked dark. It was constantly cast in the shadows of the mountains nearby, and the canopy of trees inside was exceptionally thick. Now, at one time, there had actually been a small town located deep inside of Dark Entry Forest. But all the people who had ever lived in that town were now long gone. The only things left were a few crumbling stone walls from old property lines and a couple of home foundations, all overgrown and scattered about the forest floor. The Clarks had actually seen some of these ruins as they walked along the path, but they weren't concerned by them. In fact, they felt like the old ruins actually added a certain charm to the forest, a sense of history. After the land purchase was finalized, Dr. Clark started looking for local builders in Connecticut who could help him construct this second home. But he ran into a strange problem. No matter how much money he offered these local builders, every single one of them said no. None of them ever gave him a straight answer about why they were turning him down. They would just get a strange look on their face and refuse the job. Dr. Clark just sort of assumed it was because the project wasn't that big, it was just one house after all, and the location inside the forest was pretty isolated and hard to get to. He figured that these builders probably just thought it wasn't worth all the effort for such a small job. But Dr. Clark was not a man who was easily discouraged. He decided that if nobody else would build the house, he would just build it himself. He was a very handy and competent person. He had grown up on a farm in New Jersey, so he knew how to work with his hands and he knew how to build things. And so, for the next several months, Dr. Clark made the trip from New York City to Dark Entry Forest every single weekend. And piece by piece, he built their home. First, he cut down a huge swath of hemlock trees on a flat patch of land he had picked out. Then, with all the lumber he had just created, he built a rustic but sturdy two-story cabin right there on that flat piece of land. Nearby, on a small hilltop, there was a freshwater spring bubbling up from the ground. So he laid piping all the way from that spring down into his new cabin so that they could have fresh running water. And at the bottom of another nearby hill was a beautiful brook. Dr. Clark loved to just stand and watch this brook because it was full of trout that would dart all around in the clear water. And so, Doctor, Clark built a swimming pool with these beautiful mossy embankments right up against the brook. That way, he could sit there and watch the fish for as long as he wanted. By Thanksgiving of that year, the cabin was finally done. Doctor. Clark and his wife Harriet traveled out there to stay in the cabin and celebrate the holiday. As they were sitting in their new swimming pool, watching the trout swim by and listening to the owls hooting off in the distance, they both agreed that this second home was like their own little piece of heaven on earth. Every summer from then on, and for every major holiday they could get away for, the Clarks would travel to their home in Dark Entry Forest. They would swim, and they would hike, and they would just relax. They would watch the leaves on the mountainside turn from green to brilliant yellows and oranges and reds in the fall. It was absolutely perfect. That is, until the year 1918. That summer, the couple was staying at their second home in the forest when Dr. Clark was suddenly called back to New York. There was a medical emergency that he had to attend to. Harriet was very upset at the idea of being left all alone in this cabin deep in the middle of the forest by herself for who knows how many days. And so, when she dropped her husband off at the nearby train platform, she made him promise that he would come back as soon as he possibly could. He told her he would, of course. And then Dr. Clark got on the train, and it took off. Harriet just stood there on the platform with her arms crossed, watching the train as it chugged along and disappeared into the distance. From his comfortable seat on that train, Dr. Clark had no idea that his wife was about to endure an absolute nightmare while he was gone. When the Clarks bought their 1,000 acres in Dark Entry Forest, they did almost no research on the forest itself or the surrounding area. If they had, it's very likely they would not have purchased that land. You see, the town that used to be inside of Dark Entry Forest, the one that was now just a collection of ruins that the Clarks had seen on their first walk, that town was abandoned for a very specific reason. It was cursed. At least, that's what all the locals said. And that was the real reason why no builders in the area were willing to go with Dr. Clark into the forest to build his house. They were all too scared to go anywhere near the ruins of this cursed town. This town was known as Dudleytown. It was first settled sometime in the 1740s. At first, it was just a couple of people and a few small buildings. But pretty quickly, 30 families had moved in, and for a while, it was a thriving little community. But as the 1700s started to come to a close, terrible things began to happen to the residents of this town. First, there was the Carter family. They moved to Dudleytown in 1759. Shortly after they arrived, 6 members of their family all died suddenly from cholera. The remaining members of the Carter family were so overcome with grief from their losses that they packed up and left Dudleytown. They went to New York, where they resettled. But almost immediately after getting set up in their new home, Native Americans raided their property and massacred them. The only 3 people that survived this massacre were 3 of the children, and they were all kidnapped and taken away. Then, in 1792, a Dudleytown resident named Hollister died suddenly. We don't know for sure if he fell off a roof or if he was murdered. No one really knows for certain. But what everyone could agree on was that his untimely death happened in the home of another resident, a man named Tanner. And following Hollister's death, Tanner suddenly began talking obsessively about these strange creatures he was seeing out in the woods at night. He said they were kind of roaming around the edges of Dark Entry Forest. He talked about it all the time to anyone who would listen, but nobody really paid him any mind. And eventually, Tanner went completely insane. His daughter had to care for him for the rest of his life. While Tanner was slowly losing his mind, his next-door neighbor, a man named Abel, also began reporting that he was seeing weird creatures roaming around the tree line, all around the town. And as Abel continued to report seeing these strange creatures lurking in the shadows, He too slowly went mad and had to be cared for until his death. In the early 1800s, a famous Revolutionary War hero named General Herman Swift, who lived in Dudleytown, lost his mind shortly after his wife was tragically struck by lightning and killed. Then, in 1813, some kind of unknown epidemic rolled through Dudleytown and killed many of its residents. After that, it seemed like more and more residents of Dudleytown either died suddenly or died under mysterious circumstances. And at the same time, more and more residents began coming forward with their own stories about having seen these strange, shadowy creatures moving around the edge of the tree line at night. By about the year 1900, all of the Dudleytown residents had either died or they had simply just left, abandoning their homes for good. All except for one family, the Brophies. But then, in quick succession, the Brophy family's sheep all died. Then, the mother died of tuberculosis. Then, the two sons were accused of theft in a nearby town, and then they just disappeared. This left only one person, John Brophy, the father. But soon after, the Brophy family home burned to the ground. And John, who was completely overcome with grief, just wandered off into the forest and was never heard from again. At that point, Dudleytown officially became a ghost town. Absolutely no one lived there. And it was at that point, in 1906, when Dr. Clark and Harriet had their beautiful summer's day walk through the forest and discovered the place where they wanted to build their second home. So, fast forward back to 1918. Dr. Clark is on his trip to New York for the medical emergency. It turns out to be a very quick trip. He was back on a train heading for Connecticut within 36 hours. He pulls into the station right near Dark Entry Forest, and he's fully expecting to see Harriet waiting there on the platform for him. But when the train rolled to a stop at the station, she wasn't there. Now, Dr. Clark was not a superstitious person at all. But for some reason, when he didn't see his wife there, he just felt like something was seriously wrong. There was no good reason she wouldn't have come to meet him. She had been so worried about being all alone in that cabin, and she knew exactly when he was going to be arriving. And so, feeling a little bit of panic start to set in, Dr. Clark left the train station, and on foot, he made his way over to Dark Entry Forest. When he got there and began walking up that overgrown road that led to his house, immediately, as soon as he was under the shade of the trees, he began to hear them. The owls. They were hooting very loudly off in the distance. Normally, the sound of these owls hooting made him feel welcome, it made him feel at home. But this time, he felt scared. He felt like something was wrong up ahead at the cabin. And so, he began to jog through the forest. It was getting dark under the trees, and all he could hear was the sound of these owls, and the sound was getting louder and louder and louder with every step. Finally, he reached the clearing where his property was. And at this point, the sound was a cacophony of owls hooting practically right on top of him. He looked up the small hill towards his house, and he saw that the front door was slightly open. And so now, with his heart racing, wondering what on earth was going on with his wife, Dr., Clark ran up to his front porch. He got to the door, and he flung it open the rest of the way. And then, right before he could step into his own house, a sudden, high-pitched noise began from up on the second floor. It was so loud and so startling that Dr. Clark just froze right where he was. The noise of the owls all around him in the woods was deafening, and now there was this new noise from inside the house. He just stood there, paralyzed, unsure of what to do. As he's standing there trying to get the courage to go inside and investigate, he suddenly realizes what that high-pitched noise is. It's the sound of maniacal, insane laughter, and it was coming from the second floor. Sensing that his wife had to be in danger, the doctor charged up the nearby steps to the second floor. He could tell that this laughter, this high-pitched, unhinged laughter, was coming from their master bedroom. and so he ran down the short hallway. He got in front of the closed door that led into the bedroom. He took a breath, and he slowly pushed it open. And there, in the back corner of the room, was his wife. She was on the ground, rolled up in a ball, and she was facing the door. Her hands were clenched into tight fists. Her eyes were wide open and completely unblinking. And her mouth was open wider than he thought was humanly possible. And as he's staring at his wife, trying to understand what is happening, he realizes that this insane, high-pitched laughter is coming from her. But it didn't even look like it was coming out of her. Her chest was just heaving up and down, but her mouth was just staying wide open, and this horrible laughter was just pouring out of her. The doctor just stood there watching his wife, who was staring directly into his eyes, and finally he got so scared that he turned around and he ran. During the 36 hours that Dr. Clark was away in New York, something happened to his wife. We don't know what it was, but whatever it was, it caused her to completely lose her mind. The only thing she would ever talk about after that day was the strange creatures she saw out in the forest. By some accounts, Harriet spent the rest of her life in a mental asylum. By other accounts, she went back to New York with Dr. Chris Clark, where she eventually took her own life. Today, Dudleytown is not only still abandoned, but it is also illegal to visit. It's on private property. However, people do still sneak into Dudleytown to walk around the old ruins. And many of them have reported feeling these strange pockets of cold air where there shouldn't be any. Others have said that as they've been walking, they've felt phantom hands slap them and push them. Some have said they've taken photographs inside of Dark Entry Forest near Dudleytown, and they've captured strange, shadowy figures in the pictures that they couldn't see with their own naked eye. The famous paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren even shot a special series in the 1970s inside of Dark Entry Forest. And they declared that the entire area around Dudleytown was demonically possessed. And that's where we will stop today. Because whether you believe in this or not, one thing is certain. There are places that carry stories that are not easily let go. If you like this episode, thank you for watching. I truly appreciate you taking the time to be here. Have you ever heard stories about Dudleytown, Dark Entry Forest, or any other places that feel like they don't belong on the map? Feel free to share them in the comments. I have read a lot of them. Just be careful where your curiosity leads you. See you again. A relaxed pace of life may be found in the little town of Osborne, Idaho, in the state of Idaho. It's the kind of town where everyone knows everyone else, and the routine of daily life is determined by the gentle rhythm of the changing of the seasons. A thick covering of immaculate white snow encompasses the area during the winter months, transforming the rocky hills and dense forests into a world that is silent and frozen during this time of year. Dylan Parker, who was 18 years old at the time, was negotiating the final stretch of his teenage years in this particular context. The majority of the time, Dylan was a typical child. He was in the process of determining what he wanted to do with his life after graduating from high school. He had a strong bond with his family, particularly with his mother, and he had a nice group of friends from his younger years. He, like many other adolescents, had pleasure in interacting with others, and on the evening of the 12th of January 2016, he found himself at a party with a few of his close companions for the first time. A home in his hometown was the location of the party that was being held. A continuous snowfall had been dusting the town for hours, adding to the already thick snowpack that was on the ground. It was a cold night during which the snowstorm had been occurring. At the interior, there was a friendly and energetic environment. Dylan was having a nice time, and there was music playing, people were talking and laughing, and things were going well. A couple drinks were consumed by him as the night progressed. As the hours went by, Dylan made the decision that it was almost time for him to leave the party and go home. This was not something that was out of the norm for a party like this. The effects of the alcohol were beginning to take hold of him, and the prospect of returning to the warmth and comfort of his own bed felt like a very good idea. It was the weather that was the issue. Considering that it was still snowing and that it was chilly, walking home was not a very good alternative. Therefore, he did what any other child in his position might have done. After pulling out his phone, he dialed his mother's number. As soon as his mother answered the phone, she was able to determine, without a doubt, that Dylan had been drinking. There was a slight slur in his voice, and his words were slurred. She felt the usual mixture of parental emotions, a little amount of disappointment, a touch of aggravation that he was drinking at a young age, but the thing that made her feel the most concerned was a profound sense of protectiveness over him. It was late, the weather was terrible, and all she truly needed was to know that her son was safe and sound while he was staying at home. It would be possible for them to discuss his decisions in the morning. Consequently, she listened attentively when he inquired about the possibility of her coming to pick him up. It was he who informed her that he was at a party and that he would stroll down the road to a gas station in the vicinity in order to meet her. It was a well-known location that was simple to locate. There was no uncertainty in her agreement. She informed him that she was on her way and that he should wait for her at the location she was going to be. Immediately following the conclusion of the call, Dylan's mother retrieved her keys and her coat before departing into the chilly night. As the snow continued to fall, the roads became difficult to navigate and visibility was somewhat diminished. While she was driving, she kept her mind focused on her son. Although she was imagining the lecture that she was going to deliver to him the next day, the primary objective at the moment was to just get him into the car and drive him back to the house. It was possible that she was only a few minutes away from the petrol station when her phone called once again as she was driving. Dylan was the one. On the other hand, the manner in which he spoke was entirely different this time. A comfortable and intoxicated slur was no longer present. She felt a bolt of alarm run through her body as a result of the sharp, anxious edge that had replaced it. Fear was audible in his voice. When he inquired, "Where are you?" "Where are you, Mom?" His voice was strained and frantic. "Where are you?" She attempted to reassure him that everything would be fine by assuring him that she was almost there, that she would be there in a minute or two, and that she was almost there. They were only a short distance away. However, the call was cut off suddenly. He just ended the call. It was 1 minute later when she pulled into the petrol station, which was illuminated by strong fluorescent lights. As she examined the surroundings, she anticipated seeing Dylan waiting for her, possibly stamping his feet to increase his body temperature. The snow was swirling around her car as she did so. However, he was not present. During the few minutes that she waited in the car, she entertained the thought that perhaps he was just walking down the road and was running a little bit behind schedule. However, the minutes continued to pass, and there was still no indication that he was present. She started to feel a knot of worry tightening up in her stomach. She attempted to call his phone, but the call was immediately transferred to his voicemail. That was a peculiar occurrence. Not long ago, he had called her. Why is his phone turned off at this moment? After getting out of her vehicle, she proceeded to stroll into the gas station. She inquired with the person working behind the counter as to whether or not they seen a young man who matched the description of her son. There was a head shake from the cashier. There had been no one else in the room like that. At this point, genuine fear was beginning to take hold. She got back into her vehicle and started driving around the neighborhood in the immediate vicinity. As she drove between the gas station and the house where the party had been held, she went up and down the road 3 times. She cried his name into the snowy night as she rolled down the window, allowing the chilly air to rush in. The night was silent around her. However, the only reaction that could be heard was the gentle hiss of the snow falling. "Dylan! Dylan!" Approximately 30 minutes passed while she was driving around, and her heart was beating rapidly with each passing moment. She continued to call his phone over and over again, but each and every time, the call was disconnected and sent to his voicemail. The situation was not right. This was not typical of him. That frantic phone call kept playing over and over in her head. Something had transpired in his life during the brief interval of time that elapsed between the initial call he made to her and the subsequent call he made to her. She was absolutely confident that she required assistance, and the realization gave her a chill down to her bones. She halted her vehicle, her hands shaking, and then she dialed the number for the police. The data were taken down by the police from Dylan's mother, who was in a state of panic when they arrived. The young man, who was 18 years old, went to a party, had a few drinks, and then called for a ride, and now he is missing. In a circumstance such as this one, the first notion that comes to mind is frequently that the individual is not in any real danger. Perhaps he became disoriented as a result of the booze and made the decision to stroll to the residence of a different acquaintance. Perhaps his phone had a malfunction, and he had to find a place to rest for the night nonetheless. However, there was not an immediate feeling of a significant crisis, despite the fact that the police had informed his mother that they would seek for him. Once they arrived, their first destination was the residence where the party had been held. They entered the building and immediately began conversing with the children who were still present. Specifically, they inquired about Dylan. What was the most recent time that they visited him? What kind of temper did he have? Is he going to tell you where he is going? Every single one of the responses was similar. Everyone remarked that Dylan appeared to be in good health. His disposition was upbeat, and he was simply hanging out with the other people. Towards the end of the night, he merely stated that his mother was on her way to pick him up at the gas station. After that, he said his goodbyes and went out of the door. Nobody seen him getting into a car with anyone else. Nobody overheard any arguments, and nobody witnessed anything out of the ordinary. Just now, he left. According to their point of view, the evening came to a conclusion that was entirely typical. After expressing their gratitude, the law enforcement officers returned to the outdoors. The search of the area was initiated by them. The route that led from the party home to the gas station was investigated by them. Their flashlights were able to cut through the pouring snow as they searched in ditches and behind buildings. And still, they discovered nothing. There is no trace of Dylan. They did not find any discarded jackets or footprints that they could positively identify as belonging to him. While the hours went into days, the search for Dylan Parker became more and more intensified. As time went by, the initial hypothesis that he had simply wandered out and would return with a slight hangover began to lose its validity, and it was gradually replaced with a rising concern for his well-being. A bigger number of search parties were formed by the local police enforcement. Many others, including friends, relatives, and members of the community, came out to lend a hand, dressed in heavy clothing, to protect themselves from the bitter cold of the Idaho winter. Across the entirety of Osborne, they dispersed themselves and searched in fields, neighborhoods, and wooded regions. They concentrated on the path that he ought to have followed, which was from the party house to the gas station, and then expanded their search grid in a more general direction from there. However, the snow proved a significant hindrance. Because of the severe snowstorm that occurred on the night that he vanished, any possible trails or evidence had been covered up, and the environment remained frozen solid due to the cold temperatures. It was like trying to find a needle in a huge haystack that was completely white. The family of Dylan found themselves in a state of suspended pain for a period of 10 agonizing days. They jumped with excitement at every phone call, hoping that there was some kind of news. Every time someone knocked on the door, a new wave of anxiousness was triggered. The flyers for the missing person were distributed across the entire town, with the image of Dylan's happy smile appearing on community notice boards and telephone poles. The town of Osborne came together in support of them, but in spite of all the efforts that were made, there was unquestionably nothing. At that moment, it appeared as though Dylan Parker had simply disappeared into the chilly winter air. The police had no leads to follow. Even though they had investigated his phone records, the most recent action that had occurred was that frantic call to his mother. Immediately after that, the phone was either turned off or the battery died in some way. The digital trace could not be followed in any way. After 10 days had passed since Dylan had vanished, the investigation suddenly took a tragic and unexpected turn. Police officers or search teams were not the ones who made the find. It was a complete and utter coincidence. It was a desolate region outside of town where two people were out riding their all-terrain vehicles, ATVs. As they navigated the treacherous and icy terrain, they were having a good time when they experienced a collision. Although it was not a serious incident, they made the decision to leave their damaged ATVs there and come back for them in the morning. This was because it was late in the evening. They went back to the location the following day when the sun was shining brightly in order to return and reclaim their automobiles. And at that moment, they came across something that caused them to come to a complete and utter halt. There was a body that was lying in a dense stretch of forest high up on a hill, partially covered in snow. As soon as they could, they contacted the authorities. It was determined that Dylan Parker was the deceased individual when the police arrived and recognized the body. The worst concerns that his family had had just come true. As the initial wave of shock and grief went over everyone, however, the detectives who were present at the site started to discover that something was extremely, extremely wrong. The very location was the first significant warning sign that was raised. It was a long way from where anyone had been looking when Dylan was discovered. In order for him to arrive to this location, he would have needed to walk in the opposite direction of the petrol station where he was meant to meet his mother. The petrol station was located in the middle of the town, close to the roadways, the lights, and the heart of the community. Away from all of that was the location where he was discovered. It would have been necessary for him to walk uphill, away from the town, and into the woods where it would have been dark. In no way did it make any sense at all. The presence of alcohol in Dylan's system would eventually be confirmed by a toxicology study, despite the fact that he was actually in his hometown. He was so familiar with the region that he could walk into it. In spite of the fact that he was under the influence of alcohol, it seems highly improbable that he would become so bewildered that he would walk for kilometers in the wrong way, uphill and into a tough environment that was covered in trees. By heading in the direction of the gas station, one was walking in the direction of civilization. There would have been a clear beacon in the form of the lights of the town. If you walked in the opposite direction, you would be entering a completely dark wilderness. There was a major disparity between the two routes. Why would he choose the path that would take him away from his ride home and away from the potential for danger? On the other hand, that was only the beginning of the peculiar and unsettling riddle that the detectives were currently looking into. In and of itself, the scene exhibited a number of physical inconsistencies that prevented any straightforward explanation from being possible. The snow was the component that was the most perplexing. The night that Dylan went missing, there was already a considerable amount of snow on the ground, and it continued to snow throughout the night. Dylan was in the process of going missing. There was no snowfall for the 10 days that followed, which was the time period until his body was discovered. The temperatures remained constantly below freezing, which meant that none of the snow that was already present had melted. This was an extremely important fact. A flawless and unaltered record of the ground was produced as a result of this. A clear set of tracks would have been left behind by any person or vehicle that moved through that region, and those tracks would have been preserved in the frozen snow. An exhaustive search of the entire area surrounding Dylan's body was carried out by the detectives after his body was reported missing. Footprints, tire marks, and any other indication of how he arrived were among the things that they were looking for. It was a complete failure. There were no traces that led to the body of the deceased. It was impossible to find any tracks that led away from the body. It was impossible to find any form of footsteps, not only his, but also those of anyone else. Neither an automobile nor an all-terrain vehicle left any tire tracks here. The snow that was all around him was unbroken and as smooth as silk. It appeared as though he had been meticulously positioned there from above, as if he had tumbled down from the heavens into that particular location. This revelation was the single most important factor in disproving the idea that he had strayed off and became disoriented. In the event that he had walked there, there would have been a lengthy and distinct path of his own footsteps flowing up the hill and into the woodland underneath. Neither of these trails existed. Without a doubt, it was physically impossible. Given this information, it was likely that he had been brought to that area by means of another method. If so, how? In this case, a vehicle would have left tracks. There would have been a clear path left behind, even by a snowmobile. In contrast, there was nothing. Simply by virtue of this circumstance, the investigation was transformed from a possible accident into a death that was subject to intense suspicion. As the detectives continued their search, the more peculiar these circumstances appeared. Dylan was discovered without his pants and without his boots, which was yet another piece of information that was really unsettling about the scene. However, his lower body was exposed to the elements, despite the fact that he was wearing a shirt and socks. The fact that hypothermia was stated as the official cause of death for the individual in question was a peculiar occurrence overall. Despite the fact that it is true that a person might experience a phenomena known as paradoxical undressing in the final stages of freezing to death, in which they begin to feel hot and begin to remove their garments, the fact that those clothes were completely absent from the scene was extremely suspicious. His pants and boots ought to have been laying right there next to him, or at least someplace in the immediate neighborhood, if he had removed them on his own while he was in a state of confusion. There was a thorough and extensive search of the region that was carried out. A grid was constructed by dozens of law enforcement authorities and search and rescue teams on the hillside and in the woodland surrounding the location where Dylan was discovered. They searched every inch of the area. A combination of metal detectors and K9 units that had been specifically trained to locate pieces of clothing and human scent were utilized by the team. They looked on for several days. His pants were never located by them. His boots were never located by them. All of the goods had simply vanished. The fact that he did not remove them himself at that location was strongly implied by this revelation. It suggested that they were removed and taken away from the scene by a different individual, maybe with the intention of removing any potential evidence that might have been present. The condition of Dylan's feet, on the other hand, was perhaps the most convincing piece of evidence that pointed away from the accident theory. Upon his discovery, he was only wearing socks. It would be necessary for a person to go through a difficult, snowy, and rocky forest in order to reach that remote location that is located high on a hill. If someone were to attempt that voyage without wearing boots, they would undoubtedly get multiple injuries. They would suffer cuts, scrapes, and bruises on their feet as a result of the pebbles and branches that were concealed behind the snow. This would result in their socks being ripped to shreds and covered in mud, snow, and grime. This is nothing more than basic physics and common sense. When the body of Dylan was investigated by the detectives, they were astounded to discover that his socks were spotless. There was no evidence of them being damp, unclean, or ripped. And when the feet were examined by the coroner, it was discovered that they were absolutely free of any injuries. Everything that would have indicated that he had traveled even a short distance over that kind of terrain was completely absent, including cuts, bruises, scratches, and other marks. As a result of this particular piece of information, the official story was entirely discredited. The task was not feasible. There is no way that he could have done that by foot. The absence of footprints in the snow that was completely untouched, the fact that his pants and boots were absent, and the fact that his feet and socks were clean and unharmed, all contributed to the creation of a disturbing picture. There was no evidence that Dylan Parker made his way into the woods and died of hypothermia. That is where he was brought. The circumstance had been fabricated. This somebody had either transported him or drove him to that spot via an unidentified method that did not leave any traces behind, removed some of his clothing, and then left his body there for others to discover there. The event in question was not a terrible accident, rather, it was something much more diabolical. Behind the scenes, a huge disagreement started to develop as the official investigation moved forward toward its conclusion. The official cause of death was ruled to be hypothermia according to its finding. On the basis of this information, the local authorities and the county were getting ready to conclude the case and declare Dylan's death to be the result of an undesirable accident. The story that they were constructing was that he had been drinking, that he had become disoriented in the snowstorm, that he had strayed in the wrong direction, and that he had ultimately passed away due to the frigid conditions. Although they accepted the peculiar features, they appeared determined to disregard them as anomalies that might be explained, possibly due to the fact that he was under the influence of alcohol. Nevertheless, this straightforward explanation was not accepted by all individuals. An individual by the name of David Roos, who served as the deputy coroner, was one of the important figures who disagreed. Roos had been present at the location. After examining Dylan's body, he had left. In addition, he was the kind of person who put the utmost faith in reasoning and evidence. It was very clear to him that this was not anything that could have happened by chance. Among the anomalies that were not insignificant were the pristine snow that did not have any tracks, the missing clothing that were never located, and most importantly, the spotless socks and feet that were not wounded. They were evident inconsistencies with the theory that the disaster occurred. He was certain that Dylan had been the victim of some kind of criminal activity. He was under the impression that Dylan had been attacked or killed after leaving that party, and that his body had been transported sometime later to that hillside in order to deceive authorities. He suspected that something had occurred to Dylan after he left that party. His professional view was that the scene was a planned performance. David Roos became somewhat outspoken in his expression of his worries. His findings were reported to his superiors, and he urged that the case ought to be treated as a possible homicide. He also had conversations with the investigators who were leading the investigation. He was of the opinion that it would be a grave injustice to Dylan and his family to just assume that it was an accident, that whoever was genuinely responsible for his death would be able to get away with it was the implication of this. However, his arguments were not taken seriously by anyone. Those in charge of the local government were resolute in their conclusion. In a public announcement, they stated that Dylan Parker's death was the result of an accident and that there was no evidence to suggest that he was murdered. They were formally putting an end to the investigation. David Roos was utterly appalled by this decision. His impression was that the authorities were disregarding physical evidence that could not be refuted. Instead of letting it go, he made the decision to voice his concerns to the general public. In his statement to the media, he detailed the various contradictions that were present at the site and expressed his unwavering conviction that Dylan had been the victim of an assault. He anticipated that by drawing the attention of the public to the issue, he would be able to exert pressure on the county to restart the inquiry and take a serious look at the potential of homicide. In his defense of what he considered to be the truth, he was fighting. However, the response that he received from the county was not what he had hoped for. In lieu of conducting a fresh investigation into the matter, they focused their attention on him. David Roos was terminated from his post as deputy coroner by the county shortly after he made his disagreement with the current administration public. In their formal explanation, they stated that he was no longer qualified to perform the duties of the position. Roos, on the other hand, was persuaded that he was terminated for one purpose and one reason only: to keep him hidden from the public. He was under the impression that the county was trying to cover up the case in order to avoid the hassles and potential scandal that would arise from a homicide inquiry. He was a thorn in their side. Not only did they remove his official platform by sacking him, but they also made it abundantly apparent that they would not allow any type of opposition. Therefore, the official version of events was correct. It was determined that Dylan Parker's passing was by accident. This case has been resolved. However, there was never any more investigation carried out. Never once was anyone questioned about the likelihood of a criminal act being committed. It was never attempted to identify the person or individuals who were most likely responsible for Dylan's passing. Dylan's family was placed in an unfavorable circumstance as a result of the consequences of this decision. The pain that they were left with was compounded by a terrible sense of injustice, and they were completely unable to find any answers to their questions. They were given an official explanation for their son's death that was completely illogical and contradicted all of the evidence. They had a familiarity with both their son and the community. It was unfathomable to think that he would become so disoriented that he would walk in the opposite direction of his ride home, uphill into a dark forest, and that he would accomplish this without leaving a single footprint. Although it was terrifying to think about, the idea that was proposed by the coroner, David Roos, was the only one that appeared to be consistent with the peculiar and unsettling facts. The absence of traces, the absence of garments, and the pristine condition of his feet could all be accounted for by this one explanation alone. The question is, what exactly took place with Dylan Parker on that chilly night in January? We are able to attempt to rebuild a series of events that is more credible despite the fact that it is scary based on the data. At approximately 11 o'clock at night, Dylan left the party with the intention of walking the short distance to the petrol station. During the course of that little stroll, he came across something or someone. It was possible that it was a person he knew, but it could also have been a complete stranger. A ride might have been provided to him by them. When he called his mother for the first time, he was calm. Simply put, he was validating the action plan. However, within the few minutes that followed, a terrible occurrence occurred regarding the situation. The second phone call, the one in which he sounded terrified and worried, was most likely made while this horrific new circumstance was taking place. It's possible that he became aware that he was riding in a vehicle with a person who had no intention of driving him to the gas station. It's possible that a disagreement broke out. The last time anyone ever heard from him was when he committed suicide. What happened next is unknown, but it seems likely he was taken to a different, secondary location. He was either slain on purpose or restrained and left to expire as a result of exposure to the weather. Both of these events took place at that location. The people responsible then held onto his body for some period of time. After several days, perhaps when they felt the initial search efforts were dying down or moving to other areas, they decided to dispose of his body. They chose a remote location, a place where he was unlikely to be found quickly, but a place that might eventually be discovered. They transported his body up that hillside, possibly carrying him to avoid leaving footprints. They placed him carefully in the snow, removing his pants and boots before they left. Why they took those items is a mystery. Perhaps it was to remove any potential DNA evidence that might have been on them. Or maybe, in a more disturbing twist, they were taken as a kind of trophy. This reconstruction is the only one that accounts for all the impossible evidence found at the scene. It explains why there were no tracks in the snow. It explains why his feet and socks were clean. It explains why his pants and boots were missing and never found. But because the case was officially closed as an accident, this is all just theory. The troubling questions remain unanswered. Who did Dylan encounter after he left the party? What was said or done that led to that terrified phone call? And who would go to such elaborate lengths to stage a death scene to look like an accident, only to do it so poorly that it was full of impossible contradictions? For the family of Dylan Parker, these questions are a constant, haunting presence. They are left with the memory of their son and the knowledge that the truth of what happened to him was dismissed and buried along with him, leaving a cold case in the snows of Idaho that may never be solved. You are very much appreciated for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the evening of the 13th of January, 2002, a 42-year-old man named Ronald Huff walked through the door of his studio apartment in the city of Newark, Delaware. The air outside had been crisp and cool, but the moment he stepped inside, a wave of oppressive heat hit him. It was how he always kept it, blazing hot, a detail that seemed odd to anyone who visited, but for Ronald, it was normal. He'd just returned from a visit with his grandmother, a weekly ritual for him, but today was different. He felt deeply, profoundly sick. A strange weakness was creeping through his limbs, and a dizzy spell was making the room tilt slightly. Ronald worked at a local auto dealership. He was a quiet guy, a hard worker who mostly kept to himself. His coworkers knew him as reliable, if a bit of a loner. He didn't talk much about his personal life, and no one really pressed him on it. He'd come in, do his job, and go home. That was Ronald. So for him to feel sick enough to consider missing work was a big deal. He shrugged off his heavy coat, the one he wore even on milder days, and tossed it without looking onto a nearby object. It landed draped over one of the many handmade wooden cages that were scattered around his small living room, almost like pieces of furniture. There were cages of all sizes, some stacked, some sitting alone, creating a strange labyrinth in the cramped space. He dragged his feet across the floor, his body feeling heavier with each step, until he reached the kitchen counter where his landline phone sat. He picked up the receiver, the plastic cool against his clammy skin, and dialed the number for the dealership. When the office manager answered, her voice cheerful on the other end, Ronald's was weak and strained. He explained that he wouldn't be able to make it in the next day. He was feeling really unwell, he told her, not offering any more details. He hung up the phone and leaned heavily against the counter, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to fight off the lightheadedness that was washing over him. The heat in the apartment suddenly felt suffocating. Then a sound from behind him cut through his dizzy haze. It was a low, guttural hiss. It was a familiar sound, one he heard a dozen times a day, and it was a sound that meant someone was hungry. Without even thinking, Ronald turned and walked over to his refrigerator. Instinctively, he reached out with his right hand to grab the handle and pull the door open. But the second his fingers wrapped around the handle and he applied pressure, a sharp, shooting pain jolted up his arm. He winced, pulling his hand back. He'd forgotten. His right hand was wrapped in thick, white bandages covering a nasty injury he'd gotten a week earlier. Grimacing from the pain, he switched hands, using his left to open the heavy fridge door. The cool air that spilled out was a momentary relief from the stifling heat of the room. After grabbing what he needed, he shut the fridge and walked back over to the kitchen counter. Next to the phone was a large glass jar. He unscrewed the lid and plunged his hand inside, pulling out a whole fistful of live cockroaches. They were huge, each one about 2 inches long, their legs and antennae wriggling frantically against his palm. He walked a few steps away from the counter and simply opened his hand, letting the cockroaches drop to the floor. They hit the linoleum with a series of soft clicks and scattered in every direction, disappearing into the shadows under the cages and furniture. That was one chore done. With the feeding finished, Ronald decided he just needed to lie down. The sickness was getting worse. The dizziness was back with a vengeance. As he started to walk across the kitchen, heading towards his bedroom, the world suddenly began to spin violently. The floor seemed to drop out from under him, and he could barely keep his balance. He felt a wave of nausea and weakness so profound that his legs started to buckle. He tried to keep moving to just make it to his bed, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He stumbled, then stumbled again, his steps clumsy and uncoordinated. He lurched sideways, throwing his arms out blindly to try and catch himself. His outstretched arm hit something solid, and his fingers found the edge of his apartment door. He grabbed onto the doorknob, his knuckles white, trying to steady himself and stay on his feet, but it was no use. The strength was just gone from his body. He turned, pressing his back hard against the solid wood of the door, hoping it would hold him up. But he was so woozy, so incredibly weak, that his legs finally gave out. He slid down the length of the door, a slow, uncontrolled slump to the ground. He ended up sitting there, his back pressed against the door, his legs splayed out in front of him on the floor. His head felt heavy, too heavy to hold up, and it lolled to one side. Slowly, his eyes fluttered and then closed. As Ronald Huff lost consciousness, the last things he heard were the familiar sounds of his apartment. The faint, skittering footsteps of roaches scurrying across the floor, and the distinct, wet crunch of chicken bones being crushed. 3 days passed. In the apartment next door, Ronald's neighbor was watching television when he heard the distinct crackle of police walkie-talkies out in the hallway. Curious, he got up and opened his door a crack. He saw 2 uniformed police officers and the building's superintendent standing right in front of Ronald's apartment. The neighbor liked Ronald. He thought of him as a nice, quiet guy who never caused any trouble. He couldn't imagine what the police would want with him. But then he thought about it and realized he hadn't seen or heard Ronald for several days, which was unusual. Normally, he'd hear him moving around in there. The neighbor watched as one of the officers knocked firmly on Ronald's door. "Newark Police," the officer called out. "Mr. Huff, are you in there?" They waited. No answer. They knocked again, louder this time, their knocks echoing in the quiet hallway. Still nothing. After a few minutes of this, with no response from inside, the police officers stepped back. They gestured to the superintendent, who fumbled with a ring of keys before finding the right one. He inserted it into the lock, turned it, and the lock clicked open. The superintendent stepped back, and the officers moved forward to open the door. One of the officers pushed, but the door only moved an inch or two before stopping abruptly. It felt like something heavy was blocking it from the inside. The 2 officers exchanged a look. They put their shoulders into it, pushing together with all their weight. The door groaned and scraped against whatever was on the other side, finally opening just enough for them to squeeze their heads through the gap. The neighbor watched as the officers peered into the dim apartment. A moment later, they both recoiled, jumping back into the hallway so quickly they almost tripped over each other. Their hands immediately went to the guns on their hips. One of the officers grabbed the radio on his shoulder and started talking frantically into it, his voice low but urgent. Then the neighbor watched as both officers and the superintendent quickly walked away down the hallway and out of sight, leaving Ronald's apartment door hanging partially open. As the distant wail of sirens grew closer, the neighbor's curiosity got the better of him. He took a cautious step out of his own apartment and into the hallway. From his new vantage point, he realized he could see directly into Ronald's apartment through the open door. What he saw in that brief glimpse was so bizarre, so horrifying, that for a long moment he just froze, his mind struggling to process the scene. A second later, the shock wore off and was replaced by a wave of revulsion. He scrambled back into his own apartment and slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. Hours later, the neighbor couldn't shake the image from his mind. It was seared into his memory. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and just started sketching, trying to get the grotesque scene out of his head by putting it onto the page. It would turn out that Ronald Huff had a secret, a very big secret. And on the evening of the 13th of January, 2002, right after he called in sick to work, that secret had killed him. The picture the neighbor drew showed what the police had seen. On the floor, slumped against the door, was Ronald's body. But it was horribly mutilated. His face, his ears, and his hands had been chewed away. His abdomen was torn open, and his internal organs were gone, completely eaten. And surrounding Ronald's body were the culprits. They were giant monitor lizards. He was secretly keeping 7 of them as pets inside his tiny studio apartment. He fed them a diet of live roaches and raw chicken and just let them roam free. They were massive, ranging in size from 2 feet to an incredible 6 feet long. Unfortunately for Ronald, monitor lizards are not just carnivores, their mouths are also teeming with deadly bacteria. The reason Ronald's right hand was all bandaged up was because, a week before his death, one of his lizards had bitten him. The bacteria from that bite had seeped into the wound, causing a horrible staph infection. And it was that raging, untreated staph infection that, a week later, had made him feel so sick. It was what very likely caused him to pass out and collapse against his apartment door. And after that, once he was unconscious and helpless on the floor, his hungry pets had begun to eat him. It's assumed by investigators that he died first from the infection, and then the lizards consumed his remains. However, the autopsy was inconclusive on this point. It couldn't prove that he was already dead when they started. And so, it is entirely possible that he may have still been alive when they began to eat him. After Ronald's death was discovered, animal control was called in to handle the lizards. They were carefully removed from the apartment and eventually placed in the care of the Catoctin Wildlife Preserve and Zoo in Thurmont, Maryland. From the time Gareth Williams was a young boy growing up in Wales, his parents knew he was not just smart, he was exceptionally gifted. His mind worked on a different level than other kids his age. While they were playing with toys, Gareth was devouring books on mathematics and science. His academic trajectory was nothing short of meteoric. When he was just 17 years old, he achieved a first-class honors degree in mathematics from a university in his hometown. Most people don't even start university at that age. A couple of years after that, he had earned his PhD from the University of Manchester in England. From there, he was accepted into a prestigious postgraduate course at Cambridge, one of the most famous universities in the world. It seemed he was destined for a quiet, brilliant career in academia. But he would never finish that degree at Cambridge. His incredible achievements and his rare talent for complex problem solving had not gone unnoticed. Britain's intelligence agencies, always on the lookout for the brightest minds, had put him on their radar. They began the careful and quiet process of recruiting him. In 2001, when Gareth was 23, Britain's Government Communications Headquarters, more commonly known as GCHQ, made him an offer. GCHQ is one of Britain's 3 main intelligence agencies, focusing on signals, intelligence, and information assurance. They offered him a job as a codebreaker. For Gareth, who loved puzzles and complex systems, it was a dream job. He eagerly accepted, dropped out of his course at Cambridge, and moved into a modest apartment in Cheltenham. Cheltenham is a resort town about 88 miles away from London, and it's where GCHQ is headquartered. For the next 10 years, Gareth would live and work there, dedicating his genius to protecting his country's secrets. Despite being an intensely private and shy person, Gareth thrived at GCHQ. He was a highly valued member of his team. His genius in mathematics and his understanding of technology helped his group solve some of the most difficult cryptographic challenges they faced, earning them a number of Britain's highest awards for international codebreaking. He was brilliant, and his colleagues respected him for it. Then, in 2009, his work caught the attention of another, more famous intelligence agency. The Secret Intelligence Service, also known as MI6, was so impressed with Gareth's record that they offered him a job. This wasn't just another desk job. MI6 wanted to place him on a 3-year secondment. It was a rare chance for Gareth to go operational, to become a spy in the way most people think of them from movies. He would effectively become a real-life James Bond. The opportunity was too exciting to pass up, so he jumped at the chance. But shortly after taking the job and moving into a new agency-paid apartment in London, he began to regret his decision. The culture at MI6 was a world away from the quiet academic atmosphere of GCHQ. He hated the intense, cutthroat competitiveness among the agents. He disliked the flashy culture of expensive cars and extravagant lifestyles that many of them embraced. He especially disliked the constant pressure to go out drinking and partying with coworkers every weekend. It was all part of the work hard, play hard ethos, but it wasn't who Gareth was. All he wanted to do was his job, to focus on the puzzles and the problems, and then be left alone in his private life. At GCHQ, that was perfectly acceptable. Nobody cared if he was an introvert. But at MI6, his quiet and reserved nature made him an outsider. He didn't fit in, and he was unhappy. He missed Cheltenham and his old job. He had already told his bosses he wanted to end his secondment early and return to GCHQ. Before he was scheduled to leave MI6, he took his annual 2-week vacation. But when that vacation was over, he didn't show up for work at his office in London. And for some reason, for an entire week, nobody at MI6, one of the most sophisticated spy agencies in the world, checked in on him to see where he was. It wasn't until his sister, Sari, became worried after not being able to reach him for several days that anybody started looking into his disappearance. She called the police and reported him missing. On the 23rd of August 2010, a uniformed officer was dispatched to Gareth's apartment in the Pimlico neighborhood of London to conduct a welfare check. The officer knocked on the door several times, calling out Gareth's name, but there was no answer. Following procedure, the officer located the landlord, got the key to the apartment, and let himself inside. He called out for Gareth as he entered. The first floor of the apartment was tidy, but there was no sign of him. The officer proceeded up the stairs to the second floor, still calling out Gareth's name with each step. The second floor was also empty, but there was one closed door at the end of the hallway. It was the door to the bathroom. What the officer found on the other side of that door would trigger a media firestorm and spark conspiracy theories that would make international headlines for weeks. When he opened the door, he stepped into a small, clean bathroom. Everything seemed normal except for what was in the bathtub. Sitting in the middle of the tub was a large red North Face duffel bag. And inside of that duffel bag was the badly decomposed body of Gareth Williams. The zipper of the bag was padlocked shut from the outside. The key to that padlock was found later underneath Gareth's body inside the bag. The crime scene was bizarrely clean. There were no fingerprints on the rim of the bathtub or inside it. There were no fingerprints on the bag itself, not on the fabric, not on the two zippers, and not on the padlock or the key. Gareth's iPhone was found on a nearby table, and a forensic analysis later revealed it had been wiped clean, restored to its factory settings. Investigators determined the reset had happened on August 15th. That was the last day Gareth was seen alive on CCTV footage, and it was the day that police believe he died. According to the coroner who examined Gareth's body, there were no injuries on it. There was no sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds. His toxicology report came back clean. He had no drugs or alcohol in his system. The thermostat inside Gareth's apartment had been turned up high, making the room uncomfortably hot, despite it being the middle of August. This excessive heat had drastically sped up the decomposition of his body, making it impossible for the medical examiner to determine a precise cause of death. Despite a lengthy and high-profile investigation by Scotland Yard, there has never been a conclusive determination as to what exactly happened to Gareth Williams, although there are many theories. Some believe the Russian mafia killed him. Just before his death, Gareth had been working on a case involving money laundering operations in Britain that were directly tied to Russian organized crime. This work would have certainly made him a target. Another prominent theory is that MI6 itself had something to do with his death. This theory is supported by their strange lack of action when he failed to show up for work. Why did a top secret agency not immediately check on their missing agent? In fact, one former MI6 agent has since come out publicly to say he believes there was a cover-up. He was interviewed by CNN and stated that he believed MI6 agents had gone into Gareth's apartment before the police arrived and had cleaned the scene, wiping it down to remove any fingerprints and DNA evidence that might have implicated them. The last major theory, and the one that the authorities eventually settled on, is that Gareth did this to himself accidentally. During the investigation, it was discovered that he made occasional visits to bondage and claustrophilia websites. There was also an anecdote from his landlord who said that on at least one occasion, Gareth had to call out for help because he had tied his own wrists to his bed frame and couldn't get himself undone. The theory was that he had climbed into the bag as part of some sort of escapology or sexual ritual and had become trapped. But this theory has a massive flaw. During the inquest into his death, two experts, both skilled escapologists, attempted to replicate the scenario. They tried to get inside a similar-sized duffel bag, zip it up, and padlock it from the outside. They tried over 400 times and failed every single time. They concluded it was impossible for Gareth to have done it alone. And even if, by some miracle, he had managed to get inside the bag and lock it, how could he have done so without leaving a single fingerprint on the bag, the lock, the zippers, or the bathtub? When his body was found, he wasn't wearing any gloves. Ultimately, despite all the red flags and the sheer impossibility of the official explanation, Gareth Williams' death was ruled to be probably an accident, and the case was officially closed 3 years after he was found. Growing up, Pauline Dakin always had a nagging feeling that there was something just a little bit off about her family. It was a sense of unease she couldn't quite put her finger on, a shadow of anxiety that seemed to follow them everywhere. Years later, she would find out that her childhood instincts were absolutely right. In 1970, when she was just 5 years old, her parents, Ruth and Warren, separated. For Pauline, this wasn't a huge shock. Her father, Warren, was a heavy drinker, and his temper could be explosive. The house was often filled with tension. But after the separation, when Pauline, her mother, and her older brother moved into a different house on the other side of Vancouver, Canada, things didn't get better. In fact, Pauline noticed her mom started to act even more anxious, almost paranoid, all the time. But she never explained why. When Pauline was 9, her mother gathered her and her brother in the living room and announced they were going on a surprise vacation to Winnipeg, a city over 1,000 miles away. They packed up the van, hopped in, and started the long drive across the country. When they finally arrived, they pulled up to a small house, their supposed vacation home. But once they were inside, Ruth sat her children down and informed them that this was not a vacation. This was their new home. They were never going back to Vancouver. Pauline and her brother were devastated. "Why?" they asked. "Dad is still back in Vancouver." "We want to see Dad." But their mother's face was grim. She just said, "I'm sorry, kids. This is just the way it has to be. When you're old enough, I promise I will explain everything." Confused, sad, and missing their father, Pauline and her brother had no choice but to start a new life in Winnipeg. Over the next 4 years, Pauline never saw her father and eventually lost touch with him. She slowly started to adjust to her new life, making a couple of close friends at her new school. She was just beginning to feel like Winnipeg was home. But right as she was starting to feel a sense of normalcy, her mother announced once again that they needed to move. Immediately. This time, they were going all the way to New Brunswick on the far eastern coast of Canada. Their mother made them swear an oath of absolute secrecy. They were not to tell anyone, not a single soul, about the move. But later that day, Pauline was with her best friend Wendy, and the secret just slipped out. She couldn't help it. So when Ruth came to pick Pauline up from Wendy's house, the two girls had to stage a very casual, breezy goodbye, pretending like they would see each other at school the next day, all so that Pauline's mother wouldn't suspect she had broken her promise. Once they were in New Brunswick, the family finally seemed to put down roots. They stayed there for many years. But her mother's strange anxiety never went away. She was still paranoid about something, always looking over her shoulder. The kids just had no idea what it was. Fast forward to 1988. Pauline was now 23 years old. She had moved out of the family home and was living with her boyfriend about 2 hours away. She was working as a reporter for a local newspaper. One day, her mother called her with a strange request. "I'd like to meet you at a motel," she said. "I'm finally ready to tell you everything. The truth about your childhood." Pauline was intrigued and a little nervous, but mostly excited. This was the conversation she had been waiting for literally decades. So Pauline eagerly drove to the motel. When she arrived, she saw her mother pacing anxiously in the parking lot. She walked up to her mom with a smile, about to say hello, when her mother suddenly looked at her, put a single finger to her lips, shushing her. Then, her mother jammed a plain white envelope into Pauline's hands. Scrawled on the front of the envelope were a few words. "Don't say anything. Put your jewelry inside of this envelope. It's probably bugged. I will explain everything inside. Just please don't speak." Pauline was completely bewildered, but she did as she was told. She took off her watch and her rings, put them in the envelope, and handed it back to her mother. The two of them then walked silently into the motel and into the room her mother had rented. When they went inside, a man was sitting in a chair in the middle of the room. Pauline recognized him immediately. It was Stan Sears, the reverend from their old church back in Vancouver. Her mother had worked as his secretary for the entire time they had attended that church. Pauline had always known that her mother and Stan were very close friends. They had even kept in touch after the family left Vancouver, with Stan periodically showing up for visits in both Winnipeg and New Brunswick. So, while it was a surprise to see him there, it wasn't a total shock when Pauline's mother confessed that she and Stan had fallen in love many years ago. They had been having a secret relationship ever since their time in Vancouver. But that revelation was nothing compared to what Pauline heard next. Her mother, with Stan nodding gravely beside her, explained the real reason they had to move so many times during her childhood. It was because her father, Warren, wasn't just a violent alcoholic. He was a mobster, a key member of an organized crime syndicate in Vancouver. Right after she and Warren separated, her mother found out that the mob had put a hit out on her. They believed that since her husband could no longer control her, she was a liability who knew too much. Stan then explained that he also had a hit on his head. The mob knew about his relationship with Ruth. On top of that, Stan had been providing pastoral counseling to a man in his congregation who, it turned out, was also a mobster. The mob believed this man had confessed critical secrets to Stan, making him an even bigger liability. At first, Stan said he didn't believe it. It sounded too crazy. But then he found out that the man he had been counseling had been assassinated, found dead in the trunk of his car. That's when he knew the threat was real. They decided they couldn't go to the police. Pauline's mother knew what happened to families who snitched on the mob. They were made into examples. So instead, they decided to go into hiding together. When Pauline and her family moved to Winnipeg and then to New Brunswick, Stan had secretly moved there as well, living nearby under the radar. That's why Pauline would see him show up periodically to visit. Pauline was in a state of complete shock, but at the same time, a strange sense of relief washed over her. It was a crazy explanation, but it was an explanation. It made sense of all the strange, terrifying things from her childhood. Over the next several hours, Pauline sat in that motel room with her mother and Stan and asked them every question she could think of. She learned that the time she came home from school to find her mother frantically throwing out all the food in the fridge and pantry, that was because they had received a tip that the mob had tried to poison them. These 6 different times she was suddenly unenrolled from her school and moved to another one across town, that was because there was a credible threat that the mob had discovered where she was. By the end of the weekend, Pauline had not only learned about this totally insane past, she also learned that she was still in danger. Before she left, she asked her mother and Stan what she should do to stay safe. Her mother explained that this was the real reason they had called her there. After all these years, they were tired of hiding. They had finally gone to the authorities and had been moved into a special, off-the-books witness protection program for families connected to organized crime. She said that when you enter this program, it's referred to as entering the weird world. You're not completely safe, but you have undercover agents following you at all times, monitoring you to make sure there are no assassination attempts. And before Pauline could even ask, her mother told her that as part of their entry into the weird world, they had requested that a couple of agents be assigned to monitor both Pauline and her brother, even though they didn't know about it. At this point, Stan leaned forward and handed her a small radio. He told her it was a special device that broadcast directly to the agents who were supposedly following her. He warned her to only use it in a truly desperate situation because as soon as she called for help, people would be risking their lives to save her. As Pauline held the radio, she looked at her mom and Stan and asked, "What happened to Dad? Is he in jail?" Her mother shook her head. "No," she said. "He's in the weird world too." She then handed Pauline a letter. It was from her father, addressed to her. It basically explained that he had also been moved into the weird world and that he was looking forward to Pauline joining them when she was ready. So now Pauline was standing there holding this radio and this letter from her supposedly mob-connected father, completely overwhelmed. Her mother just told her, "Go home. Think about what you want to do. If you want to join the program and enter the weird world with us, just let me know and we'll make it happen." Pauline, still in a total state of shock, gave her mom and Stan a hug and said she would be in touch. She left the motel and got into her car. She was about to back out when she saw Stan running out of the motel room holding something in his hand. She stopped and Stan ran up to her window. "Hey, I forgot to give you this," he said. He held up a round, flat piece of metal. He told her it was a magnetized GPS transponder. She should stick it somewhere out of sight underneath her car. He explained that it constantly transmitted her location to the agents following her, so it would be easier for them to find her if she was in trouble. Pauline thanked him, took the device, and placed it under her car. Stan went back into the motel. Pauline drove home with the intention of just taking a few days to process this insane information. Her plan was to think it over before committing to joining this weird world. But after only a couple of days, her paranoia was through the roof. Every shadow seemed like a threat. Every car behind her seemed to be following her. She dumped her boyfriend, quit her job, and moved out of her house into a new, secret apartment. She called her mother and said, "I can't take it anymore. I feel totally unsafe. I want to join the weird world." Her mother and delighted. They told her it was a complicated process, but they would get it started. During this waiting period, Pauline met a new man named Kevin, who would eventually become her husband. As she talked to him about her situation, sharing the wild story, she started to have doubts. The more she said it out loud, the less real it sounded. She decided she needed to know for sure. She had to set up a sting operation on her own mother. So, Pauline called her mother, her voice filled with fake panic. "Mom! Oh my goodness, someone just broke into my apartment. I think it was the mob. I don't know what to do. Should I call the police?" Her mother immediately responded, "No. Whatever you do, don't call the police. I'm going to get in touch with Stan and see what his contacts say." A few minutes later, her mother called back, her voice calm. "Okay, honey, I spoke to Stan. He spoke to the undercover agents who are parked outside your house. They said, yes, 2 men from the mafia did break into your house. But don't worry. the agents went in and grabbed them. They're in custody now. You're safe. And in that moment, Pauline's world shattered for a second time. She told her mom, "Mom, I made that up. No one's been in my apartment. I've been here all day. I lied to you." It was then that Pauline finally understood. Her mother and Stan had been living a complete lie since she was 5 years old. There was no mafia. Her father was not a mobster. It was all a fantasy. It would turn out that Stan was suffering from a rare psychiatric condition called delusional disorder, where an otherwise high-functioning person has one specific, unshakable delusion. His delusion was that the mafia was after him. And over the years of their close relationship, he had passed that delusion on to Pauline's mother through a phenomenon called folie à deux, or shared delusional disorder, where a dominant personality can transfer a delusion to a more subordinate one. After confronting both her mother and Stan, neither of them ever admitted it was a lie. They couldn't. They truly believed it. To their dying day, they believed the mafia was after them. Their biggest concern after Pauline exposed the lie was not that they had been caught, but that Pauline was now in grave danger because she was no longer taking precautions. They were terrified she would be assassinated by the mafia. Pauline never got an apology or a real conversation about the damage this decades-long lie had caused, but she ultimately found a way to make peace with her bizarre past. She wrote about her experience in a best-selling memoir titled Run, Hide, Repeat. On the 15th of September 2010, a 55-year-old man named Greg Flanagan checked into the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas. It was a Monday, the start of his work week. As a young man, Greg had lived a life of adventure, working as a chief engineer on massive ocean-going vessels, spending months at a time out at sea. But in his middle age, he had reinvented himself as a landman. It was his job to travel around and secure leases for mineral rights and land for drilling operations. He was slender and looked fit, which was surprising considering he never exercised and had been a chain smoker for most of his life. He kept a close-cropped white beard and had the tanned, weathered skin of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors. Every Monday morning, Greg would make the 2-hour drive in his pickup truck from his home in Lafayette, Louisiana, all the way to Beaumont, Texas, where his company would always put him up in a room at the Elegante. The hotel was nothing special, not fancy, but not a dive either. To Greg, it didn't matter. All he needed was a bed to sleep in and a television to watch. His room, number 348, was simple. When you walked in, there was a small bathroom immediately to the right. A little farther in, the room opened up. Straight ahead was a window that looked down over a small courtyard pool lined with potted plants. The main space had a queen-size bed pushed up against the right wall, and on the left wall, there was a dresser with a TV on top. Greg wheeled his single suitcase into the room and placed it at the foot of the bed. He unzipped it and began his weekly routine. He carefully pulled out the collared shirts he would need for the week, making sure they stayed wrinkle-free, and hung them neatly in the closet. He then took out his toiletries, which were kept in a cloth bag with a convenient hook, and he hung the bag from the towel rack in the bathroom. After unpacking, he took off his worn-in brown work boots and his faded blue jeans and slipped into a comfortable pair of pajama pants. Anytime Greg stayed at the Elegante, he rarely left his room. There was a bar downstairs in the hotel lobby, but Greg wasn't much of a drinker or a socializer. He much preferred to have quiet nights by himself, just relaxing and watching TV. So, that night, Greg walked over to the wall unit and cranked the air conditioning up as high as it would go. He liked to sleep in a room that was practically freezing cold. Then, he got into bed, but he didn't lie down. He propped 2 big pillows up against the headboard and leaned back, getting comfortable for a night of channel surfing. He took a clean towel from the bathroom and laid it out on the empty side of the bed next to him. On this towel, he methodically arranged all his nighttime essentials: his ashtray, his pack of cigarettes, his lighter, his cell phone, the TV remote, and a candy bar. Everything he needed within arm's reach. He picked up the remote, turned on the TV, and began flicking through the channels. He eventually landed on a station that was playing the movie Iron Man 2. Good enough, he probably thought to himself. He put the remote down, picked up his candy bar, and unwrapped it. He took a bite, then grabbed a cigarette from the pack, lit it, and settled in, smoking and watching the movie. The following morning, Susie Flanagan, Greg's wife, didn't get her usual morning call from her husband. Every single morning that he was away for work, without fail, Greg would call her to say good morning and check in. It was their routine, and this was a major break from it. She started to feel a little worried. She tried calling his cell phone, but it just rang and rang until it went to voicemail. He never picked up. Growing more concerned, she called his office in Beaumont. He didn't answer his desk phone either. After trying his office a second and third time, one of his coworkers finally picked up. They told her that Greg hadn't come into work yet and they hadn't heard from him. Now Susie was genuinely concerned. A knot of dread formed in her stomach. She felt like something was wrong. She asked his coworkers, "Do you mind just going over to his hotel? Can you knock on his door and just make sure he's okay?" They agreed immediately and said they would head right over. Two of his coworkers drove to the hotel. They went up to the third floor to room 348 and knocked on Greg's door. There was no answer. They knocked again, louder this time, calling his name. Still silence. They went back down to the front desk and got the hotel manager, who came up with a master key. The manager unlocked the door and pushed it open, and right away they found Greg. He was lying dead in the middle of his hotel room floor. The position of his body suggested he had fallen first to his knees and then pitched forward onto his face. His left arm was sort of tucked underneath his body, and still clutched between the first two fingers of his left hand was a cigarette that hadn't fallen. It had burned all the way down to the filter. The room was exceptionally warm, and Greg's skin had a strange grayish-blue tint. Immediately after seeing him, his coworkers called 911. Shortly after the paramedics arrived, Detective Scott Apple of the Beaumont Police Department pulled up in his cruiser. Apple was a short, very fit guy with silver hair that he wore spiked up. He looked like a cop straight out of Central Casting, and he was known for working cases relentlessly. When he got up to room 348, he saw no signs of a break-in. Nothing inside the room seemed to have been disturbed. There was no blood and no obvious wound on Greg's body, with the single exception of a slight abrasion on his cheek, likely from when he fell and hit the carpet. Detective Apple looked around the room and found Greg's wallet, still in the back pocket of his jeans, which were folded on a chair. It was full of cash. Robbery was clearly not a motive. He went back out into the hall and began interviewing the occupants of the surrounding rooms. No one had heard anything unusual. No one had seen anything suspicious. He went back into the hotel room and conducted a more thorough search, looking for any kind of drugs or any substance that Greg might have taken that could have led to his death. There was nothing. No prescription pill bottles, no illegal drugs, no alcohol. Later that day, after the family had been notified of Greg's passing, his grief-stricken wife, Susie, called Detective Apple. Through her tears, she told him, "You know, my husband did not take good care of himself. He had a terrible diet. He's been smoking like a chimney since he was a teenager, and he never went to see a doctor. I always told him if he wasn't careful, something like this was going to happen. I always worried that he might have a heart attack or something." At this point, everyone involved was thinking the same thing. Greg's family thought he had died of natural causes, and Detective Apple agreed. Based on everything he had seen at the scene, there was absolutely no evidence of foul play. It just looked like a tragic case of a man whose unhealthy lifestyle had finally caught up with him. Greg's body was sent to the Jefferson County morgue to be examined by Dr. Tommy Brown, who was the local medical examiner. He was a veteran pathologist who had seen just about everything. Doctor. Brown had read the preliminary report, which suggested Greg had likely died of a massive heart attack. When Greg's body was wheeled in, there was nothing on initial visual inspection that contradicted that theory. The only two marks, Doctor. Brown noted on the outside of Greg's body were the small abrasion on his face from the fall and another very small, almost insignificant abrasion on his crotch. Beyond that, his body was completely unblemished. There were no bruises, no cuts, no signs of a struggle. But when Dr. Brown began the internal examination, the case took a shocking turn. It looked like someone had literally crushed Greg's insides. His entire torso was filled with blood. Food from his intestines had been ripped out and was loose inside his abdominal cavity. He had multiple broken ribs, several of his internal organs were lacerated, and there was a small, neat hole in his heart. Dr. Brown was completely baffled. The severity of Greg's internal injuries was more consistent with someone who had been in a severe car crash or had a multi-ton object fall on them. But Greg didn't have any of the corresponding external injuries that would support those scenarios. And he was found in the middle of a locked hotel room where nothing was disturbed and no one had seen or heard a thing. Dr. Brown concluded his report stating, "Look, I don't have all the answers here, but this was not a natural death. This is a homicide. My best guess is he was beaten to death. I know it doesn't quite make sense because there are no external injuries, but he suffered some kind of significant blunt force trauma from another person, and that is what killed him." When Detective Apple received this report from the medical examiner, he was just as confused as Dr. Brown was. But now he had a murder on his hands. His focus shifted immediately. If Greg was murdered, who would want to kill him? He started digging into Greg's background, interviewing friends, family, and coworkers. He found that Greg was universally liked. He was known for being incredibly courteous and polite. He was a quiet man who kept to himself. He was deeply in love with his wife, and she loved him back. There was no evidence of any secret life, no gambling debts, no affairs, no scandals in his past. He was just a genuinely nice, normal guy. It made absolutely no sense why anyone would want to kill him, let alone with such bizarre, unexplainable violence. After a few months, the investigation had gone nowhere. In reality, it had never even really gotten started, because there was no logical starting point. The only odd detail from the crime scene that Apple kept coming back to was that the room was unusually warm when the body was found, which was the opposite of how Greg liked to keep it. But a warm room didn't explain why his insides were crushed. And so, with no leads and no suspects, Apple was about to put the case on the back burner when he made a small discovery. He was reviewing hotel records and found in the maintenance logs that on the night Greg died, he had been making popcorn in his room's microwave and had somehow managed to blow a fuse. It wasn't just his power either. The blown fuse had also cut the power to the room on his right, the room on his left, and the room directly below him. The log showed that Greg had called the front desk and a maintenance man had been sent up to reset the breaker. This opened up two new, albeit weak, theories for Detective Apple. The first was that the maintenance man, who did have a minor criminal record, had attacked Greg when he went up to fix the breaker. But this was wildly speculative. There was no evidence and no motive, so it was quickly ruled out. The second theory involved Greg's neighbors in room 349. They were two electricians who were in town for a job. They were known to be heavy drinkers and partiers. Apple theorized that maybe when Greg accidentally cut the power to their room, they got angry. Maybe they went out into the hall, saw Greg, and figured out he was to blame. And then, in a drunken rage, they attacked him, killing him. It was a stretch, but it was the closest thing to a potential motive Apple had found. So, Detective Apple put on a hidden camera and went to interview the two electricians again. When he spoke to them, they were very forthcoming. They seemed honest and were appropriately curious and concerned about what had happened to Greg. They told Apple, "Look, we had no interaction with him at all. We did hear him coughing next door when we came back from the bar that night, but honestly, that's it. The electricians voluntarily offered up their cell phone numbers and email addresses, telling the detective that if he needed anything at all, they would be happy to help." Apple left the interview feeling they were telling the truth. At this point, Detective Apple was back at square one. The one promising lead he had, the maintenance log, had turned out to be a total dead end. With no other avenues to explore, the case went cold. 7 months after Greg's death, with absolutely no progress made, Susie decided she couldn't just let it go. She wanted to hire a private investigator. A friend suggested she call Ken Brennan, a famous private detective who was known for solving a lot of very complex, seemingly unsolvable cases. On a whim, Susie looked up his number and called, not really expecting to get through to him. But to her surprise, he picked up the phone himself. She told him the whole confusing story of what had happened to her husband, and Ken said he was intrigued. He would take the case. Ken was a former Long Island cop and a retired DEA special agent. He spoke with a thick New York accent and wore t-shirts that were just a little too tight, showing off his muscles, often paired with a big, gaudy gold chain. He looked more like a character from a mob movie than a detective. As soon as he agreed to take the case, he flew to Lafayette, Louisiana to meet Susie. He sat down with her and asked a lot of tough questions about her marriage, about whether Greg might have been cheating, if he had any kind of secret life she didn't know about. After he was satisfied that those were all dead ends, he asked her, "Can you tell me anything about the crime scene that stood out to you? Anything that seemed off?" Susie thought for a moment and said, "Yes. Greg always kept the air conditioning on freezing cold at night. So I thought it was really strange that when his coworkers found him, the AC was off and the room was hot. That is so unlike Greg." Ken made a note of this. Then he flew to Beaumont to meet with Detective Apple. The two men, despite their different styles, actually got along very well. Apple, feeling like he had hit a wall anyway, agreed to work with Ken on the case. He took Ken to the hotel, showed him room 348, and then turned over his entire case file. The autopsy report, the crime scene photos, all of his notes. That night, Ken went through every single document, every photograph. The next day, he walked into Apple's office and said, "I think I figured it out." Apple was skeptical. "Really? You figured it out in one day?" Ken insisted. "No, seriously. I have to confirm one thing with his wife, but I have a theory." Right there in front of Apple, Ken called Susie. When she answered, Ken asked her a simple question. "Hey, did your husband ever smoke with his left hand, or did he always use his right hand?" Susie replied without hesitation, "Oh no, he only ever smoked with his right hand." Ken said, "Thank you very much," hung up the phone, and turned to Apple. "I got it," he said. Apple leaned forward, listening intently. Ken laid out his theory. "Okay, so Susie told me it was very strange that the room wasn't cold. We know from the maintenance log that the power went out and was restored at 8:30 p.m. When the power came back on, the TV would have come back on, but the air conditioning unit would not have automatically restarted. The room would have still been cold from being air conditioned all evening, so Greg probably wouldn't have noticed right away that the AC was off. He just went back to watching TV. But this is Beaumont in the summer. That room would have gotten hot really quickly. He would have noticed within about 30 minutes and gotten up to turn the AC back on. Since the AC was off when he was found, he must have died after the power came back on at 8:30, but before the room got warm enough for him to notice. That puts his time of death somewhere between 8:30 and 9 p.m. Apple was impressed. "That's pretty good," he said, "but it doesn't tell us how he died or who killed him." Ken held up a hand. "I'm building the picture," he said. Next, the cigarette. It was found in his left hand, but his wife confirmed he was a right-handed smoker. So what I think happened is he's sitting on the bed, smoking with his right hand. Then something catastrophic happens to him. He jumps off the bed and starts heading for the door to get help. He transfers the lit cigarette from his right hand to his left hand so he can use his dominant right hand to open the doorknob. But he doesn't make it. He collapses and dies, the cigarette still in his left hand. Apple nodded. It makes a lot of sense. But what was the catastrophic event? Ken smiled. I have a theory on that too. But I need to go back to the hotel room. So Apple and Ken went back to room 348. Ken walked inside and started examining everything, looking at the ceiling, the floor, the walls. Finally, he stopped, looking at the wall by the entryway. He pointed to a spot on the wall. There, he said. Apple looked. It looked like a small spackled patch on the wall, right around where the doorknob would hit if the door swung open too hard. That's just from the doorknob, Apple said. Ken shook his head. He took the door and swung it open all the way until the doorknob pressed against the wall. The point of impact was several inches to the right of the patch. The patch was not from the doorknob. Before Apple could ask what he was thinking, Ken was already on the move. He went next door, to room 349, the electrician's room. They went inside, and Ken started running his hands all over the shared wall, feeling for any imperfections. Eventually, he stopped. He looked up at Apple, then took his index finger and pushed on one specific spot on the wall. As Apple watched, Ken's finger went right through. He had pushed out a small plug of dried toothpaste that had been used to conceal a tiny hole in the wall. Apple immediately called in a crime scene unit. They carefully excavated both sides of the wall and then shined a laser from the hole in room 349 into Greg's room. The trajectory of the laser beam lined up perfectly with where Greg would have been sitting up in bed watching TV. Ken and Apple went back to the medical examiner, Dr. Brown, and told him, "Look, you missed something." Greg was shot. Greg's body had already been cremated, but they still had the detailed autopsy photos. They looked at them again, and sure enough, that tiny, insignificant abrasion on his crotch was actually a small caliber bullet entrance wound. And the hole Dr. Brown had found in Greg's heart was perfectly aligned with the bullet's trajectory. Dr. Brown realized his mistake and amended the autopsy report to reflect death by a gunshot wound. With this new, undeniable evidence, Ken and Detective Apple brought in Lance, one of the electricians from room 349, for another interview. They told him it was just a routine follow-up. They had him sign a sworn statement reattesting to his original story that he hadn't seen or heard anything. Lance read it over and said, "Yeah, that's right. I wish I knew more to help you." He signed the document. The second he put the pen down, Ken leaned forward and said, "All right, we got you. We know a gunshot was fired from your room that night, and that's what killed Greg Flanagan. So you need to start talking, or you're going to jail right now for filing a false police report." Lance crumbled. The whole truth came pouring out. He said that he and the other electrician, Muller, had been drinking heavily that night. Muller had gone out to his truck and brought his pistol back into the room. He was drunk and goofing around with it, waving it around. Lance said he told him to stop, but Muller kept playing with it, at one point even aiming it at Lance. Lance said he batted the gun away, and Muller dropped it. The gun hit the floor and went off. They saw the bullet hole in the wall leading into the next room. They both froze and listened. They didn't hear a scream, no sound at all. After a few minutes of silence, they convinced themselves that the room next door must be empty and that they had gotten away with it. So they just left and went to the bar. When they came back later that night, they heard Greg coughing next door, which further convinced them that he must have come back to his room after the gunshot and was perfectly fine. The next day, when they saw Greg's body being carried out on a gurney, they panicked, thinking they had killed him. But then they overheard Detective Apple talking to other officers in the hallway, saying that it looked like natural causes, probably a heart attack. They were flooded with relief. They actually believed it was just a bizarre coincidence that Greg had a heart attack on the same night they fired a bullet into his room. But deep down, Lance admitted they knew they were probably responsible. So they covered their tracks. They plugged the bullet hole with toothpaste and hid the gun. Ultimately, Mueller, the owner of the gun and the one who had been waving it around, was charged with manslaughter. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. On the 27th of April, 1997, a farmer in a rural part of Indonesia was walking his livestock through a thick, dense sugarcane field near his house when he stumbled, tripping hard on something hidden in the dirt. After he caught his balance, he looked down to see what he had tripped over. It was a strange mound of freshly turned earth that seemed completely out of place in the otherwise flat field. His curiosity was piqued, and he wanted to dig it up to see what was underneath, but he knew he wasn't on his own property. So instead, he turned around, led his livestock back to his village, and went to find the village leader. He told him about the strange pile of dirt and suggested someone should go and see what was buried there. The village leader gathered some other men, and they all headed back out to the sugarcane field. They found the mound of dirt exactly where the farmer said it would be. The first thing they did was take a long, sturdy stick and poke it into the pile. The stick slid easily into the soft dirt. When they pulled it back out, a horrible, sickening stench billowed out from the hole, filling the air around them. It was the unmistakable smell of decay. Worried about what they might find, the men decided to leave it alone. They went back to the village and reported the strange, smelly mound to the local authorities. The authorities, however, told them to go back out there, dig up the mound, and report back on what they found. So, the village leader and a few more men returned to the field, this time armed with shovels. They began to dig into the soft earth. Pretty quickly, their shovels struck something soft, buried just beneath the surface. They put their shovels down and started digging carefully with their hands. After clearing away a bit more dirt, they uncovered a human face looking right back at them. It was a woman. It appeared she had been buried vertically in a hole up to her neck, and then someone had just piled dirt on top of her head. At this point, the authorities were called again, and this time they came out to the scene. They were able to excavate the body and identify her as a 1-year-old local woman named Dewey. After asking around the village, police determined that the last time anyone had seen Dewey alive was 3 days earlier when she had left her house to run an errand. After that, she had simply vanished. No one knew what had happened to her. Just a few hours after Dewey's body was discovered, a 5-year-old boy who worked as a rickshaw driver came to the police station. He had information. He told the police that 3 days earlier, on the evening of April 24th, the same day Dewey was last seen, she had hired him for a ride. When she got into his rickshaw, he asked her where she wanted to go. She was very secretive. She told him she didn't want to tell him her specific destination. Instead, she just told him to drive in a particular direction, and she would give him more instructions as they got closer. This really intrigued the young driver. After he had been driving for a while, he turned to her again and pressed her for more information. "This is very strange," he said. "Can you please tell me where we are going?" Finally, Dewey relented. She leaned forward and whispered that she was going to see the shaman. In that culture, a shaman is someone who is believed to use magic to cure the sick and solve people's problems. The driver thought it was a bit odd that she was going to see the shaman in the middle of the night and being so secretive about it, but he didn't think too much of it after he dropped her off. That is, until he heard that she had been found dead. The police immediately went to the home of the local shaman, a 5-year-old man named Ahmad Siraji. They asked him if he had been with Dewey on the night of April 24th. At first, Siraji denied it completely. He said he hadn't seen her and had no idea what happened to her. But after the police got a warrant and searched his house, they found some of Dewey's personal belongings hidden inside. Confronted with this evidence, Siraji's story changed. "Okay," he said, "I have been lying. I have a confession to make." And then, in a chillingly nonchalant tone, he told the police that not only had he killed Dewey, but he had also killed dozens of other women in the exact same way, and he had buried all of them in that same sugarcane field. The police, stunned by this confession, went back out to the field and began a systematic search. They found dozens of mounds of dirt, just like the one Dewey was found in, scattered all over the property. Underneath each one, they found the body of a woman buried up to her neck. After the excavation was complete, the police believed they had found the bodies of 42 different women. But in truth, that was just a guess. They believed there could be even more. During his trial, Ahmad Siraji explained in detail why he did what he did. He said that back in 1986, 11 years earlier, he had a vivid dream. In the dream, his deceased father came to him and gave him a set of instructions. His father told him that if he drank the saliva of 70 women, he would become a powerful and immortal healer. When Siraji woke up, he didn't dismiss it as just a strange dream. He believed he had received a genuine spiritual command from his father's spirit. He decided he would do as he was told. But his father hadn't explained how he was supposed to get the saliva from these 70 women. After thinking about it for a few days, Siraji decided that the most efficient way to complete his task would be to kill the women and then forcibly take their saliva. To find his victims, Siraji began spreading a rumor throughout his village that he was a shaman with supernatural powers. He claimed he could grant women everlasting beauty and make them rich. And in his community, many people believed him. As the rumor spread to surrounding areas, women began to come to him requesting his services. He would tell them to come back to his house late at night when it was completely dark and to not tell anyone where they were going. When a woman arrived, she would come inside his house and pay him a fee, which was roughly equivalent to $300. Then he would tell her that he needed to perform a special ritual to grant her beauty and riches. He would lead the woman out of his house through a nearby cemetery and into the dark sugarcane field. They would walk for a while until Siraji stopped them in a secluded spot. He would then hand the woman a shovel and tell her to dig a hole in the ground, assuring her that this was a necessary part of the ritual. So he would stand there and watch as she dug a hole until it was about waist deep. Then he would tell her to get into the hole and put her hands down by her sides. If she seemed nervous, he would calmly reassure her that this was all part of the process, that many other women had done it before, and that it was perfectly safe. Once she was in the hole with her hands at her sides, Siraji would take the shovel and begin to fill the hole back in with dirt, packing it tightly around her until she was completely immobilized from the waist down. At this point, with the woman trapped and helpless, Siraji would pull out a length of electrical cable. He would wrap it around her neck and strangle her to death. Once she was dead, he would drink her saliva. Then he would dig the hole a little bit deeper, put the body back inside, and bury her completely, making sure that her head was oriented so that her face was looking towards his house. He believed that having the spirits of these women constantly looking at him gave him more power. He said that in Dewey's case, when she first came to his house and paid the fee, she got scared. She was worried about going out into the dark field to do the ritual. So Siraji told her to wait. He went into another room where his 3 wives were and told one of them, "Hey, I'm gonna go kill this girl and I need your help. I need you to go calm her down." His wife, who he claimed had no idea her husband was a serial killer, immediately went along with it. She went into the other room and assured Dewey that everything was totally fine, that they had done this ritual many times before, and that it was perfectly safe. She even offered to come along with them. At this, Dewey felt much more calm and agreed to go. The trio left the house, walked through the cemetery, and out to the field. Only 2 of them came back. Ahmad Siraji was executed in 2008 by a firing squad. His wife, who acted as his accomplice, was sentenced to life in prison. On the 20th of July 1968, a small fishing boat named El Fausto left its port on La Palma, one of Spain's Canary Islands, and set off for El Hierro, another island about 50 miles to the south. On board were three very experienced sailors, the brothers Ramon and Eliberto Hernandez, and their cousin Miguel Acosta. Their trip to El Hierro was smooth and uneventful. It took them about 7 hours. They arrived at the port in the early evening and unloaded their cargo, which was actually a shipment of explosives used for agricultural purposes. After the cargo was unloaded, the three of them went into town to get some food and relax for a bit before heading back to the dock to prepare for their return journey. Later that evening, as the three men were on their boat, stowing their gear and getting ready to depart, they saw a man running down the dock, waving his arms frantically to get their attention. They stopped what they were doing and called out to him, asking what he needed. The man, out of breath, introduced himself as Julio Garcia. He was clearly very upset and was talking so quickly that they had to ask him to slow down. He explained that his wife had called him earlier that day from their home on La Palma. Their 2-year-old daughter was very sick, and he needed to get home immediately. He had rushed to the port to catch the last ferry back to La Palma, the same island the three fishermen were from, but he had missed it. The next ferry wasn't scheduled for another 2 days. So Julio had been running up and down the dock, desperately trying to find anyone with a boat who might be willing to take him to La Palma. He was prepared to pay whatever it cost. Of course, the crew of El Fausto immediately told him not to worry. They were heading to La Palma anyway, as it was their home port, and they would be happy to give him a ride. They told him he didn't need to pay them anything. Relieved, Julio thanked them profusely and began helping them load the rest of their supplies onto the boat. They had some food, about 22 pounds of fruit, and a supply of fresh water. Once everything was loaded, they untied their lines from the dock and set sail for La Palma. They departed at about 2:30 inches the morning on July 21st. The water was calm during their return trip. The only weather they had to contend with was a light mist that formed over the water in the early morning hours after the sun came up, but it wasn't thick enough to affect their ability to navigate. And even if the fog had been more severe, Ramon, Eliberto, and Miguel were seasoned sailors who had been navigating these exact waters since they were teenagers. They had sailed in far worse conditions and always made it home safely. But at 10 a.m. that morning, the scheduled arrival time for El Fausto in La Palma, the boat didn't appear. The owner of the boat was waiting at the dock for them. When they didn't show up on time, he wasn't overly concerned. He knew the three men well and trusted their skills. In fact, he normally would have gone on the trip with them, but he had other commitments on the island. He figured they had probably run into some minor mechanical issue. El Fausto was an old boat, and it had had problems in the past, but after a little while, the families of the crew started to gather at the dock, asking the owner where their loved ones were. The owner, still not particularly worried, but wanting to reassure the families, decided to take action. He told them, "I'll send a search boat out. They'll take the exact same route El Fausto was on, just in reverse. I'm sure they'll run right into them and help them fix whatever problem they're having." So a search boat was sent out. For hours and hours, it motored along the exact charted course that El Fausto was supposed to be on, but they were nowhere to be found. The search boat radioed back to the owner and said, "We can't find them." "What do you want us to do?" He called them back in. He realized that if they weren't anywhere near their route, then something more serious must have happened. It was at this point that he contacted the authorities, and a much larger, more formal search and rescue effort was launched. Planes and boats fanned out over the sea to look for El Fausto and her 4-man crew. Everyone involved in the search was operating with a huge sense of urgency. They had been told that the men on board had very limited supplies, just 22 pounds of fruit and a small amount of fresh water. If they weren't found within a couple of days, the chances of finding them alive were slim. But despite the massive search effort, a couple of days passed with no sign of the boat. Hopes began to fade. People started to fear the worst. But then, on July 25th, 4 days after El Fausto had vanished, a British ship called the Duquesa radioed in an incredible message. They had found a small fishing boat drifting aimlessly in the open ocean. There were 4 people standing on the deck waving flashlights to get their attention. As the British ship got closer, they were able to read the name on the hull. It was El Fausto. El Fausto had been found about 120 miles west of La Palma. They had drifted way, way off course. But when the Duquesa pulled up alongside them, they could see that all 4 crew members were alive. In fact, they seemed to be in relatively good spirits. They were certainly dehydrated and starving and very grateful for the water and food the British sailors gave them. They were obviously a bit shaken up from being lost at sea, but beyond that, they seemed okay. That message was quickly relayed back to the friends and family waiting anxiously on La Palma. When they were told that the men had been found and were alive, there was a huge celebration. They had all thought their loved ones were dead. But a couple of hours after that first joyous transmission from the Duquesa, a second, very strange message came through. The captain of the Duquesa reported that the crew of El Fausto was refusing to be towed back to shore. They were insisting that their boat was fine and that they just needed a few supplies and they would be on their way. The captain of the Duquesa was baffled. He asked them, "Then why are you out here? How did you end up 120 miles off course? Something must have gone wrong with your boat." But the men were evasive. They just said, "No, there's nothing wrong with the boat. No mechanical issues. Everything's fine. We appreciate the offer, but we don't need a tow." Even Julio, the man who had been so desperate to get home to his sick daughter, was saying the same thing. "No, we're good. We don't need a tow." The captain of the Duquesa couldn't believe what he was hearing. He thought, "What am I missing here? You drifted 120 miles out into the Atlantic. You're incredibly lucky we found you. You probably would have died of dehydration in a few days. We are offering to guarantee your safety, to bring you home to your families, and you're telling us to leave?" But he could not convince them. They were polite, but firm. They just needed some food, water, cigarettes, and a little bit of fuel. And so ultimately, the crew of the Duquesa gave them what they asked for. They provided them with enough fuel for about 18 hours of travel, along with plenty of supplies. The British sailors watched as the 4 men on El Fausto started their engine, waved goodbye, and sailed off to the east towards La Palma. The captain of the Duquesa radioed the authorities on La Palma and told them that based on their location and speed, El Fausto should be expected to arrive in port at around 7 p.m. that evening. Back on La Palma, a huge party started at the dock. Friends, family, and hundreds of other islanders gathered, drinking wine and celebrating the imminent return of the 4 men. But 7 p.m. came and went, and El Fausto did not appear. As the hours ticked by, the festive atmosphere turned to one of deep worry. The nightmare was starting all over again. The next morning, El Fausto and her crew were once again declared missing. This time, Spain launched the largest search operation in its history. Military bombers, Coast Guard ships, and civilian vessels scoured the area where the Duquesa had last seen them. For 2 weeks, they searched relentlessly, but they found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no sign of the boat or its crew. Finally, the search was called off. The 4 men were declared lost at sea. 2 months later, on October 9th, an Italian merchant ship called the Ana di Mayo was on its way to Venezuela when it spotted a small fishing boat bobbing aimlessly in the distance. The boat was far too small to be making a transatlantic voyage. As they got closer, they could see that there was no one on deck and no one in the cabin. When they were close enough to read the name on the hull, they saw it was El Fausto. The Ana de Mayo pulled up alongside the fishing boat and tied it off. Two of the Italian sailors boarded El Fausto, calling out to see if anyone was there, but they were met with silence. The boat itself was in surprisingly good condition. There was no sign of damage or violence. They went into the cabin looking for a logbook that might explain what had happened, but there was none. The sailors were left scratching their heads. How could a perfectly seaworthy boat end up abandoned in the middle of the Atlantic? Where was the crew? They still needed to check the small space below deck that housed the engine. The two sailors found the hatch on the deck, opened it up, and peered down into the darkness. A horrible smell wafted up. They shone a flashlight down and were met with a gruesome and inexplicable sight. Lying on his back on the floor of the engine room was the body of a dead man. He was partially mummified. He had no clothes on, and he was clutching a small transistor radio to his chest. The sailors reeled back in shock. After composing themselves, one of them climbed down into the engine room to look for more clues. There was only the one body. But tucked behind the body, he found a small notebook. The sailors took the notebook back to their ship and opened it. The first thing they noticed was that a large section in the middle of the notebook had been torn out. 28 pages were missing. All that was left were a few pages at the beginning and a single page at the end. The first few pages contained only some simple notes and math calculations. The last page appeared to be some kind of farewell message, but the handwriting was difficult to read and the language was a bit confusing. The captain of the Ana de Mayo radioed Spanish authorities, informing them that they had found El Fausto and that they intended to tow it with them to Venezuela, where they would turn over everything to the authorities. They attached a tow line to the bow of El Fausto and began their journey. 2 days later, the Spanish authorities received a crushing telegram from the Italian ship. The night before, as El Fausto was being towed, it had suddenly lurched forward, its bow plunging down into the water. It sank so rapidly that it snapped the thick tow line and disappeared beneath the waves before the Italian crew could do anything to stop it. The boat and the body inside it were now gone forever, lost at the bottom of the Atlantic. All that remained was the small notebook. The notebook was sent to La Palma and shown to the families of the four men. Julio's wife immediately identified the handwriting as his. This meant the dead man in the engine room was almost certainly Julio. His wife was able to decipher most of the final page. It was a detailed list of instructions for her on what to do after his death. It listed his insurance policies and properties. And then, at the very bottom of the page, he had scrawled one last cryptic message. Don't ever tell our son all that has happened to me. You know that God wanted this fate. Love you. If Julio knew he was about to die, why didn't he write down what had happened? He had to have known that whoever found his body in this notebook would have so many questions. Unless, of course, he did write it all down, and the explanation was in those 28 pages that were torn out of the middle of the notebook. If so, who removed them, and why? And where were the other three men? Why did they refuse a tow that would have guaranteed their safety? For over 50 years, these questions have remained unanswered. The most widely accepted theory is that the crew simply experienced a series of compounding problems and, in a state of panic, made a series of bad decisions that led to their deaths. But others believe there are just too many strange details for it to be that simple. And so, the mystery of El Fausto and her crew endures. From a man dying in a locked hotel room, to a spy found inside a sealed bag, to a childhood built on a lie, a crew lost at sea without explanation, and a hidden horror buried beneath a perfectly normal life. Tonight we followed 5 stories that all asked the same impossible question. What really happened when no one was supposed to know? Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And if you want more stories like these, there's a whole playlist waiting for you to binge right now. Until next time.